Le 9 janvier 1990, Richard Lyon, 42 ans, roule à grande vitesse dans Highland Park, une petite ville du Texas. Il s'arrête dans un crissement de pneus devant l'hôpital presbytérien.
Il est entré en disant « Aidez-moi, ma femme est dans la voiture. Elle ne se sent pas bien. » Le personnel des urgences est sorti et a trouvé une femme repliée sur elle-même sur le siège passager.
À peine consciente, la femme de 37 ans dit au médecin qu'elle a été malade toute la journée.
Il y avait une épidémie de grippe à l'époque à Dallas. Les médecins ont donc pensé qu'elle avait la grippe et ils ont commencé à la soigner pour ça.
Mais Nancy ne réagit pas au traitement.
Sa tension était basse. Elle avait des nausées, des diarrhées et elle vomissait.
Et ils se sont vite rendus compte que ce n'était pas une grippe.
Nancy Dillard Lyon n'est pas une patiente ordinaire. Promotrice immobilière brillante, elle est la fille de Bill Dillard père, l'un des hommes d'affaires les plus puissants et en vue de Dallas.
Bill Dillard était surnommé Big Daddy. C'était un des industriels les plus célèbres de Dallas.
La famille Dillard était très riche et très puissante. C'était une puissance très discrète. Il s'exposait peu, mais ça restait une des familles les plus puissantes de Dallas.
Pendant des heures, plusieurs spécialistes sont allés voir Nancy. Ils savaient qu'il ne s'agissait pas d'une maladie ordinaire.
Aux urgences, les médecins ont pensé à un syndrome du choc toxique, une maladie infectieuse.
Alors que la famille et les amis de Nancy soutiennent Richard dans la salle d'attente, les médecins n'arrivent pas à établir un diagnostic.
Et ils leur ont posé des tas de questions. Était-elle allée à l'étranger? Qu'avait-elle mangé? Ils essayaient de comprendre ce qui se passait.
Ils ont fait tout ce qu'ils pouvaient, mais rien ne donnait de résultat. Les médecins et les infirmiers ne comprenaient pas.
Soudain, l'état de Nancy s'aggrave.
Les symptômes sont passés rapidement des vomissements et des diarrhées à des convulsions.
Son système respiratoire et son système rénal s'affaiblissaient et les médecins ne pouvaient rien y faire.
Elle est ensuite tombée dans le coma. 5 jours plus tard, le 14 janvier, les proches ont été informés que Nancy était en état de mort cérébrale. Et ils ont alors pris la décision de la débrancher des appareils qui la maintenaient en vie.
La mort de Nancy Dillard Lyon devient le sujet de conversation en ville. Chacun veut savoir comment une jeune femme de la haute société, apparemment en bonne santé, a connu une fin si soudaine et tragique.
Tout le monde était sous le choc. Beaucoup de gens ont assisté aux funérailles et l'église était pleine à craquer. Le chagrin était palpable. Au début, le chagrin dominait. Presque personne ne pensait alors à autre chose qu'une mort tragique, due à une étrange infection.
Mais chez les Dillard, à l'abri des regards, les soupçons apparaissent.
La famille pensait à un meurtre et a contacté le bureau du procureur.
Alors que Richard donne son accord pour une autopsie, Big Daddy fait pression sur la police pour qu'une enquête soit menée.
La famille suspectait quelque chose, mais on ne connaissait pas la cause de la mort. Et on ne saurait rien avant la conclusion de l'autopsie. Les médecins parlaient de choc toxique. On ne pouvait pas faire grand-chose à ce moment-là.
Mais ce que les Dillard ont à raconter éveille la curiosité de la police.
Il s'était passé quelque chose de bizarre. Quelqu'un avait déposé une bouteille de vin et une boîte de médicaments devant chez Nancy, avec un mot, pour une femme unique, de la part d'un admirateur secret.
Sa famille pensait que c'était peut-être ça qui l'avait rendu malade.
Richard raconte que Nancy recevait des menaces par courrier depuis des mois.
Un ancien patron de Nancy était impliqué dans une affaire très violente. Au tribunal, le témoignage de Nancy l'avait fait plonger.
Et les menaces continuent.
Richard a reçu un mystérieux appel sur son répondeur. Elle a payé. Tu es le prochain.
C'est à cet instant que les enquêteurs reçoivent un appel de la morgue.
Le médecin légiste m'a dit que la cause de la mort de Nancy Dillard Lyon était l'empoisonnement à l'arsenic.
Les rapports toxicologiques indiquaient que son corps contenait 100 fois plus d'arsenic que la normale.
Le rapport d'autopsie a fait de ce décès une affaire de meurtre.
Jadis, l'arsenic était connu pour être le roi des poisons et le poison des rois. C'était l'arme idéale pour éliminer un ennemi sans attirer l'attention sur soi. Dans cette affaire, la princesse des Park Cities en a été victime. Mais qui est le coupable?
Quelques jours après le décès mystérieux de Nancy Dillard Lyon, l'autopsie révèle un taux mortel d'arsenic. Les enquêteurs écartent rapidement l'ancien patron de Nancy de leur liste de suspects et s'intéressent de plus près aux proches de la victime.
J'ai contacté M. Dillard chez lui, après l'enterrement, pour qu'on se rencontre. Il m'a parlé de beaucoup de choses, et notamment d'inquiétudes dont Nancy lui avait fait part.
Peu avant sa mort, Nancy a confié à son père avoir des problèmes de couple.
Nancy Lyon était une personne très discrète. Elle était en train de se séparer de son mari, mais personne dans sa famille n'était au courant. Ils ne l'ont su que très peu de temps avant son hospitalisation.
Et Big Daddy fait une annonce explosive.
Il a dit « On pense qu'il a essayé de la tuer ». Il parlait de son gendre, Richard Lyon.
Mais Big Daddy reconnaît qu'il ne s'agit que d'une intuition. Or, les enquêteurs ont besoin de plus qu'une simple accusation pour résoudre l'affaire.
On n'avait vraiment pas grand-chose à part des soupçons de la famille de Nancy. Et ce n'était pas suffisant. Personne n'aurait pensé accuser cet homme d'avoir tué sa femme, la mère de ses enfants.
Les longs cils et les yeux mélancoliques de Richard cachent-ils l'âme d'un monstre? Et s'il a bien empoisonné sa femme, pourquoi ce geste? Pour répondre à ces questions, les enquêteurs vont devoir fouiller derrière la façade du conte de fées qu'est la vie de Nancy Dillard Lyon.
Nancy Dillard était la plus jeune de 4 enfants. Les gens la décrivaient comme une jeune fille studieuse, timide, jolie, très intelligente et ambitieuse. Elle tenait beaucoup de son père.
Nancy est née dans une famille riche. Elle a vécu dans une grande maison. Les enfants allaient au lycée d'Highland Park. Ils n'ont jamais manqué de rien.
La plupart de ses amis vont ensuite dans de grandes universités texanes. Mais Nancy choisit Hollins, une prestigieuse université pour femmes en Virginie. Quelques années plus tard, elle est attirée par des études de paysagisme et de design.
Elle s'est inscrite à l'école de design d'Harvard. C'est là-bas, dans un des cours, qu'elle a rencontré Richard Lyon, un jeune homme du Connecticut.
Richard n'était pas particulièrement pauvre, mais il était loin d'avoir la fortune de Nancy.
Son père était agent d'assurance. Ils étaient 5 enfants. Il gagnait un salaire modeste. Il faisait partie de la classe moyenne qui lutte pour s'en sortir.
Ils viennent de 2 mondes différents, ce qui ne les empêche pas de tomber amoureux.
Ils passaient tout leur temps ensemble. Lui était plutôt tranquille et elle était la plus énergique du couple.
Ils avaient le même niveau d'études. Ils révisaient souvent ensemble. Ils avaient appris à imiter l'écriture de l'autre, et il est arrivé que Nancy écrive certains des devoirs de Richard. À la fin de leurs études, ils ont décidé de se marier.
Après un mariage spectaculaire, le couple s'installe dans les Park Cities.
À Dallas, tout le monde sait que les gens les plus riches et les plus puissants vivent dans les Park Cities.
À Dallas, les Park Cities sont surnommés la bulle. C'est une sorte de club de loisirs coupé du monde extérieur. Les habitants ont de l'argent ou voudraient en avoir. Après avoir bien réfléchi, ils ont décidé de s'installer près de Dallas, sur les conseils de Richard. Big Daddy connaissait tout le monde à Dallas, et il pouvait rapidement leur obtenir un emploi.
Venant du Nord, on pourrait penser que Richard a du mal à s'adapter au monde de Big Daddy. Mais à la plus grande surprise de la famille Dillard, leur gendre se sent à Dallas comme un poisson dans l'eau.
Il a oublié les Lyon pour devenir un Dillard. Il s'est vite adapté à ce monde. L'argent, l'influence, le nom qui ouvre des portes. Il était parfaitement à l'aise.
Tout le monde disait qu'au début de leur mariage, ils formaient le couple typique des Park Cities. Ils étaient amoureux et heureux.
Nancy travaillait pour Trammell Crow, le Donald Trump du Texas, un grand promoteur. Elle était très connue dans ce milieu.
Mais malgré 2 salaires, le couple a toujours du mal à boucler les fins de mois.
Ils n'étaient propriétaires de rien. Leur maison était hypothéquée et ils n'avaient pas encore remboursé le prêt pour leur voiture. Vous imaginez?
Heureusement, quelqu'un est toujours là pour les aider.
Grâce au père de Nancy, qui payait leurs factures, ils parvenaient à vivre au jour le jour.
Elle luttait pour que son mariage fonctionne, pour que ses enfants aillent bien, que son travail se passe bien. Et elle faisait tout pour faire plaisir à ses parents, et surtout à son père.
Mais les enquêteurs ne tardent pas à découvrir que même si Nancy tente de sauver les apparences, son mariage apparemment idéal commence à battre de l'aile.
La vie de Nancy et Richard a commencé à changer à la fin des années 80. À l'époque, Richard travaillait comme chef de projet dans le bâtiment à Houston. Il était donc souvent absent. Il voyageait souvent avec une autre chef de projet, Tammy. Et ils ont commencé à avoir une aventure.
Mais Richard tient encore à Nancy et il accepte de vivre seul pour qu'ils essaient de régler leurs problèmes.
Elle l'aimait. Elle avait construit sa vie autour de leur famille unie et parfaite. Elle voulait que leur fille vive avec leur père.
Des amis du couple disent aux enquêteurs qu'en décembre, Nancy et Richard se réconcilient et qu'ils vivent de nouveau ensemble dans la bulle. Apparemment, ils repartent sur de bonnes bases.
Monsieur Dillard m'a dit que sa famille appréciait Richard. Nancy l'avait épousé et il était le père de ses petits-enfants. La famille l'a donc accueilli à bras ouverts.
Nancy et Richard passent les fêtes de fin d'année ensemble dans le Connecticut. Mais leur bonheur retrouvé ne durera pas. Un peu plus d'une semaine après leur retour, Nancy est hospitalisée. Elle ne rentrera jamais chez elle. Quelques jours après la mort de sa fille, Big Daddy est hanté par de lourds soupçons à propos de Richard, mais il n'a aucune preuve de ce qu'il avance.
Le couple avait 2 faces. D'un côté, il y avait le couple heureux, parents de 2 petites filles que la famille et les amis adoraient. Et de l'autre côté, il y avait le couple qui traversait une mauvaise passe. Mais ça ne suffisait pas pour parler de meurtre.
Les enquêteurs s'intéressent plus particulièrement à l'attitude de Richard alors que sa femme est mourante.
Chacun réagit différemment à ce genre de situation. Mais les infirmiers et les médecins nous ont raconté qu'il se comportait comme s'il était à une fête. Et il aurait même dragué des infirmières.
Il n'a jamais agi comme un mari inquiet dont la femme est en soins intensifs et peut mourir d'un moment à l'autre. Il nous paraissait trop calme et serein, vu la situation.
Les enquêteurs recherchent ensuite l'ancienne petite amie de Richard et sont surpris par ce qu'elle leur apprend. Leur aventure ne serait en fait pas terminée.
Il était en contact avec elle alors que Nancy était à l'hôpital.
Tammy Ann, une jeune blonde aux yeux bleus, raconte aux policiers que leur relation n'a jamais cessé, même après la mort de Nancy.
Richard dépensait sans compter pour Tammy. Il la couvrait de cadeaux. Il lui a offert une montre d'une valeur de 4 500 $, un manteau en cuir hors de prix. Il l'emmenait en voyage dans les Rocheuses du Colorado ou à Taos au Nouveau-Mexique.
Une semaine avant l'hospitalisation de Nancy, Richard annonce à Tammy que sa femme est mourante.
Richard lui a dit qu'à leur retour du Connecticut après Noël, il avait emmené sa femme à l'hôpital parce qu'elle souffrait d'une maladie du sang incurable.
La famille de Nancy était révoltée et les policiers n'en revenaient pas.
Les enquêteurs ont enfin trouvé un mobile possible. Mais en dehors du comportement inattendu de Richard, ils n'ont pas grand-chose à se mettre sous la dent.
Ce n'était pas une affaire de meurtre ordinaire. On savait que personne ne viendrait nous dire « je l'ai vu la tuer ».
Le choix de l'arme du crime était le seul élément dont nous disposions. On ne recherchait pas un pistolet, un couteau ou un club de golf, mais une preuve que Richard avait empoisonné sa femme.
Mais les enquêteurs ne sont pas encore en possession de cette preuve. En l'absence de témoins et de traces d'arsenic chez les Lyon, rien ne prouve que Richard n'est pas l'auteur du crime parfait.
Un mois après l'empoisonnement à l'arsenic de la riche Nancy Dillard Lyon, les soupçons se concentrent sur Richard, son mari. Mais sans preuve concrète, les policiers ne peuvent pas prendre le risque de dévoiler leurs doutes et ils demandent aux Dillard d'en faire autant.
À ce moment-là, la famille de Nancy était convaincue que Richard était le coupable. Mais il devait se taire. Je crois que ça a été compliqué pour eux. Richard ne cherchait pas spécialement à passer du temps avec eux, mais la famille faisait croire qu'elle était présente pour lui. Ils prenaient soin de lui, ils faisaient leur deuil ensemble.
Mais quand il n'est pas avec la famille Dillard, Richard n'a rien du veuf éploré.
Peu après la mort de Nancy, la petite amie de Richard passait beaucoup de temps chez eux avec leur fille. J'ai trouvé ça louche et de mauvais goût, pour ne pas dire plus.
Et ce n'est pas tout.
Richard Lyon n'a jamais appelé pour savoir pourquoi et comment sa femme était morte. En général, les membres de la famille veulent savoir. Mais Richard ne nous a jamais contactés, ni moi, ni le médecin légiste.
Pendant des semaines, les enquêteurs contactent des vendeurs de produits chimiques.
Trouver où il aurait pu acheter ou commander du poison, c'était chercher une aiguille dans une botte de foin.
Un jour, une entreprise de Houston a de bonnes nouvelles. D'après ses registres, un certain Richard Lyon lui aurait acheté des produits 4 fois.
Il leur avait acheté un grand nombre de différents poisons.
Richard Lyon avait fait son premier achat en janvier 1990 et le dernier le 27 novembre de la même année. Il avait acheté du mercure, du carbonate de barium, du nitroferricyanure de sodium, de l'arsenic et du trioxyde d'arsenic.
Et il a acheté tous les produits qui comportaient le mot cyanure ou arsenic. Bref, tout ce qui contient du poison. On a récupéré ses chèques. Et les employés du laboratoire de Houston nous ont affirmé pouvoir l'identifier.
Richard s'est fait livrer certains de ses produits à son bureau.
Ses employeurs nous ont expliqué qu'il utilisait des produits organiques et pas ce genre de produits.
Ça nous a confortés dans le fait que nous étions sur la bonne piste.
Les policiers convoquent Richard pour un interrogatoire. En apprenant la cause de la mort de Nancy, étrangement, il n'éprouve aucune émotion.
Il n'a pas eu l'air surpris qu'elle ait été empoisonnée. Il n'a pas réagi, il est resté calme et serein. C'est étonnant pour quelqu'un dont la femme est morte empoisonnée à l'arsenic un mois avant. Mais il n'a posé aucune question sur les circonstances de cet empoisonnement.
Quand les policiers lui demandent s'il sait pourquoi sa femme a été en contact avec de l'arsenic, il répond tranquillement que Nancy et lui ont travaillé sur un nouveau produit pour éliminer des insectes.
Ils faisaient des expériences. Ils cherchaient un moyen de tuer les fourmis de feu.
Richard avait fait un schéma. Il comptait percer dans la fourmilière et introduire de l'arsenic à la base pour tuer la reine.
N'ayant rien contre lui, les enquêteurs doivent relâcher Richard.
On faisait tout ce qu'on pouvait. On essayait de trouver la moindre preuve médico-légale, parce qu'au fond de nous, on savait déjà qu'il était coupable.
La police ne peut plus garder le secret de la cause de la mort de Nancy. Quand le terme empoisonnement apparaît dans les médias, Dallas est en ébullition.
Neighbors of 37-year-old Nancy Dillard Lyon say they can't understand why anyone would want to kill this mother of two.
La nouvelle de sa mort avait déjà été un choc, mais c'était encore pire d'apprendre qu'une jeune mère, venant d'une famille respectée, avait été assassinée.
Tout le monde s'intéressait à cette affaire. Il s'agissait d'une famille riche d'Highland Park. Les gens étaient attirés par le côté polar de l'histoire.
police are remaining tight-lipped about the suspect and the progress of the investigation.
Toute l'affaire est devenue un cirque dans les médias. On entendait et on lisait autant d'informations véridiques que de mensonges. Chacun y allait de son hypothèse absurde.
Sous la pression de la Haute Société de Dallas, qui demande des réponses, la police finit par faire une annonce.
Police investigators confirm they have only one suspect in their probe of the arsenic murder of Nancy Dillard Lyon. Police say they are looking hard at her husband, Richard Lyon.
Avec la pression qui augmente, son mariage avec une femme riche pourrait alors sauver Richard. Il fait appel à l'avocat le plus cher qu'il trouve et se prépare à mener le combat de sa vie.
Quelques jours après la désignation de Richard comme suspect principal, son avocat récemment engagé donne une conférence de presse.
Tout le monde parlait de cette affaire en ville. Dès que j'entrais chez le coiffeur ou dans un magasin, j'entendais les gens en discuter. Le sentiment général était la culpabilité de Richard. Mon client était devenu l'ennemi de la population.
Contrary to the accusations made recently by the police, I did not poison my wife, Nancy Dillard Lyon, nor did I have anything to do with her tragic death.
I can tell you that our investigation on his behalf is very thorough. In the event that this case becomes a murder charge, this will be an honest-to-goodness, Perry Mason-style whodunit.
Les enquêteurs décident de jouer le tout pour le tout. Entre la petite amie et les factures de produits chimiques, ils n'ont que des preuves indirectes, mais convaincantes.
On savait qu'on n'obtiendrait jamais des aveux de Richard et que personne ne viendrait nous dire « je l'ai vu la tuer ». On a décidé qu'on avait assez de preuves. De toute manière, on ne pouvait pas en avoir plus.
Un matin de mai, 5 mois après la mort de Nancy, Richard est inculpé de meurtre avec préméditation.
Brian was driving down Preston Road early this morning after dropping his 2 daughters off at childcare. Police pulled him over, which apparently came as a total surprise.
Richard Lyon avait l'air effrayé d'être dans cette situation. Il était sûrement surpris, mais il avait surtout très peur.
Richard Lyon's arrest warrant paints a damaging picture of a man who says he didn't do it. Police later learned Richard Lyon ordered and purchased barium carbonate, arsenic, and other chemicals through his employer. The employer tells police Lyon is not authorized to order such chemicals.
Richard a enfin été démasqué. Tout Dallas est d'accord pour l'envoyer sur la chaise électrique. Mais Richard a encore un petit espoir. Il lui reste une carte malhonnête à jouer.
Un soir, après 22 heures, j'ai reçu un appel de Richard. Il m'a dit « Venez tout de suite, j'ai trouvé quelque chose ». Je me suis levé, je me suis habillé et je suis allé chez lui. On est allé dans sa chambre. Il avait trouvé des papiers de Nancy. Elle avait écrit sur sa peur d'avoir des relations sexuelles, sur son sentiment d'impuissance quand elle perd le contrôle.
Ensuite, Richard révèle un sombre secret de famille.
Richard m'a raconté qu'il avait su que Nancy avait eu une relation incestueuse avec son frère.
Quand Nancy avait 11 ans, son frère Bill en avait 13. Et leur mère les a surpris en plein acte sexuel. Elle en a été bouleversée. La seule réaction de la famille a été d'envoyer Bill en internat. Et c'est tout. Je pense que c'est quelque chose qui a marqué Nancy à vie. D'ailleurs, quand Richard a commencé à être infidèle, Nancy s'est sentie en partie responsable.
Un an avant sa mort, les vieilles blessures se sont rouvertes.
Son père, Big Daddy, a affirmé que ses enfants avaient simplement joué au docteur et que c'était tout à fait normal. Mais Nancy savait que ça n'avait absolument rien de normal.
C'était une jeune femme très perturbée. Était-elle malheureuse? Ça ne fait aucun doute. Richard était sûrement le premier homme qu'elle ait vraiment aimé et en qui elle ait eu confiance. Donc quand il a décidé de déménager et de demander le divorce, ça a dû être traumatisant pour Nancy.
Richard raconte à ses avocats que lorsqu'ils ne vivaient plus ensemble, Nancy avait reçu un bouquet de fleurs.
Nancy lui a dit que les fleurs avaient été envoyées par l'école de leur fille. Richard a lu la carte qui accompagnait le bouquet. C'était écrit « Nous sommes navrés de la façon dont vous traite votre mari ». Mais en faisant des recherches, on s'est rendu compte que Nancy s'était envoyé elle-même les fleurs.
Qu'en est-il alors de la bouteille de vin et des médicaments qu'elle a trouvés sur le pas de sa porte?
Nancy avait dit qu'elle avait trouvé une bouteille de vin devant chez elle. La bouteille était débouchée, et pourtant, elle l'avait bu. Attendez, reprenons. Cette femme est allée à Harvard. Elle est intelligente. Elle trouve une bouteille de vin devant chez elle et elle la boit. Et en plus, de façon très théâtrale, elle donne la bouteille à la nourrice et lui dit « S'il m'arrive quelque chose, remettez-la à la police. »
Les avocats de la défense apprennent aussi que Nancy s'est rendue plusieurs fois à l'hôpital avant sa dernière visite.
Je suis persuadé que plusieurs de ces passages à l'hôpital n'avaient aucune raison d'être. Jamais aucun diagnostic clair n'était établi. Mais c'était efficace, puisqu'à chaque fois, Richard se précipitait à l'hôpital pour l'accompagner et s'occuper d'elle.
Mais la révélation la plus surprenante vient de l'équipe d'experts en toxicologie de la défense.
J'ai envoyé des échantillons de cheveux, d'ongles et de sang pour une analyse de routine. Et les résultats étaient vraiment étonnants. Si quelqu'un est exposé à de l'arsenic, la quantité de poison dans ses cheveux et sur ses ongles est très similaire. Or, Nancy avait 5 fois plus d'arsenic sur les ongles que dans les cheveux. La seule explication médico-légale était qu'elle avait touché l'arsenic avec ses doigts.
Les résultats indiquent aussi que c'est 3 semaines avant sa mort et le jour de son entrée à l'hôpital que les doses d'arsenic ingérées sont les plus fortes.
L'accusation avait prouvé que Richard avait manipulé de l'arsenic 7 jours avant l'hospitalisation de Nancy.
On en a donc conclu que Nancy s'était administré elle-même l'arsenic.
La stratégie qui consiste pour la défense à accuser la victime, en général, me répugne. Mais là, je dois avouer que Dan Guthrie a élaboré une défense incontestable. Dallas a son histoire de meurtre et la population a hâte d'en entendre tous les détails sordides.
Quelques jours avant le procès pour meurtre de Richard Lyon, les habitants de Dallas sont prêts à suivre ce feuilleton dramatique.
Une famille riche, des diplômés de Harvard vivant dans des park cities. Voilà de quoi attirer l'attention. Et en plus, une histoire d'empoisonnement à l'arsenic, c'est plutôt rare.
Les gens qui ne vivaient pas dans la bulle allaient enfin savoir ce qui s'y passait. C'était l'idéal pour une curiosité malsaine. Et pourtant, au Texas, on ne manque pas de procès et de meurtres. Mais là, on était au niveau supérieur.
Au début du procès, l'accusation est persuadée que le jury va assembler le puzzle.
J'aurais préféré pouvoir démontrer qu'il avait bien acheté les produits chimiques et qu'il y avait un lien chronologique entre le laboratoire, Richard et la bouche de Nancy. Mais quoi qu'il en soit, je savais qu'on avait raison. C'était lui le coupable.
Il y avait des preuves matérielles irréfutables qu'elle avait été empoisonnée, que Richard avait acheté du poison et qu'il avait été infidèle. C'était impensable que l'accusation perde.
Mais la défense cherche la moindre faille dans l'argumentation de l'accusation.
N'oubliez pas que Richard a étudié à Harvard. Il était intelligent. Et d'après la théorie de l'accusation, il aurait tué sa femme avec de l'arsenic. Pensez-vous vraiment que ce genre de personne achèterait de l'arsenic sous son propre nom et qu'il le ferait livrer à son bureau en sachant que ça laisserait des traces? Il ne faut pas oublier que c'est Richard qui a insisté pour que Nancy aille à l'hôpital.
Franchement, j'ai toujours pensé que c'était bizarre qu'un homme qui a empoisonné sa femme l'emmène ensuite à l'hôpital. Moi, je n'empoisonnerai jamais la mienne. Mais si ça m'arrivait, je n'appellerais personne avant qu'elle soit morte. Et je ne me retrouverai surtout pas auprès d'elle au moment où elle meurt.
Pendant les déclarations préliminaires, le tribunal est plein à craquer.
Il y avait au moins 1400 personnes qui s'arrachaient les 86 places assises.
C'était plein tous les jours. Des gens de la haute société. Et il y avait beaucoup de journalistes.
La famille Dillard avait tout organisé pour que la salle soit toujours pleine. Il y avait une liste de gens et des horaires pour remplir la salle. Les deux seules personnes qui étaient là pour soutenir Richard étaient ses parents.
Le procureur impressionne plus par son physique que par ses attaques.
On était un peu distrait par les cheveux de la procureure. Jerry Sims avait des cheveux longs au moins jusqu'à la taille. Dès qu'elle se levait, elle faisait un mouvement de la tête pour les faire bouger. Les journalistes ne parlaient que de ça, du genre la chevelure est arrivée.
Madame Sims est au centre de toutes les attentions. Un jour, après son entrée fracassante dans la salle d'audience, l'un des amis riches des Dillard aurait lancé « Mon royaume pour une paire de ciseaux ».
À mon avis, il détestait Nancy. Mais il ne voulait surtout pas perdre le nom de Dillard. L'influence de la famille, les portes que ça lui ouvrait professionnellement, s'il divorçait, il allait perdre tout ça.
Il n'avait pas de bonnes intentions. Il pensait qu'en l'empoisonnant lentement, tout le monde penserait qu'elle était malade et n'y verrait que du feu.
Comment le suspect lui a-t-il administré le poison? L'accusation ne le sait pas encore. Mais une découverte troublante dans l'ancien appartement de Richard lui fournit une réponse probable.
La jeune femme qui vivait alors dans l'appartement cherchait un médicament dans sa boîte à pharmacie et y a trouvé une boîte de capsules. Il s'agissait de médicaments au nom de Nancy Lyon.
Les tests révèlent que quelqu'un a modifié ces capsules en y ajoutant du cyanure.
C'étaient des capsules que Richard donnait certainement à Nancy. Elle ne soupçonnait pas qu'il l'empoisonnait tous les jours.
On pense qu'il faisait des essais avec différents produits pour trouver le moyen de la tuer. On avait la preuve qu'il avait acheté plusieurs produits à l'arsenic. On a récupéré ses chèques et on avait les témoignages des employés du laboratoire qui lui a vendu les produits chimiques.
Mais il manque encore quelques pièces à ce puzzle.
L'autopsie indiquait qu'elle avait ingéré une forte dose d'arsenic 3 semaines avant d'entrer à l'hôpital et une autre dose ce jour-là. L'accusation devait prouver que Richard avait eu accès à de l'arsenic dans ce laps de temps.
Pour la défense, le suspect principal est Nancy elle-même. Les avocats de Richard la décrivent comme une femme malheureuse qui ne se remet pas des douloureuses cicatrices de l'inceste.
Inutile de dire que Nancy avait beaucoup de problèmes. Son mari voyait une autre femme et elle allait divorcer. La défense voyait ça comme une cause de vulnérabilité. Elle pensait que Nancy pouvait avoir des tendances suicidaires.
Les notes retrouvées par Richard après la mort de Nancy sont présentées comme des preuves et lues pendant le procès.
J'essaie d'avoir la famille parfaite, occupée, frustrée, anxieuse, exigeante, autoritaire, trop ambitieuse. Ma famille en souffre. Quand je n'ai pas de pouvoir, je me sens incompétente. Quand je perds le contrôle, je suis en colère. J'ai peur de Bill et de ses désirs. Relations sexuelles anormales, mes problèmes d'inceste.
La salle d'audience n'a pas fini d'être surprise. La défense présente en effet la facture d'une entreprise de produits chimiques. Le patron, Charles Koch, est appelé à la barre.
Charles Koch a expliqué qu'il avait reçu un appel d'une femme qui lui avait posé des questions sur un poison qui pourrait éradiquer un problème de fourmis de feu dans son jardin. La femme s'est présentée, Nancy Lyon.
Sur la facture, il y avait le téléphone professionnel de Nancy, son numéro personnel et un numéro de permis de conduire du Texas. Et la facture était claire. Nancy avait acheté des produits chimiques. La seule explication médico-légale de la présence de 5 fois plus d'arsenic sur ses ongles que sur ses cheveux était qu'elle avait touché l'arsenic. À mon avis, Nancy s'est administré elle-même le poison, dans le but étonnant d'essayer de dissuader Richard de divorcer. Mais elle en a trop ingéré. Et ça l'a tué.
L'avocat de Richard avait raison. On nage en plein film policier. Mais en fait, l'histoire n'est pas encore terminée.
Alors que les derniers témoins passent à la barre, l'accusation tente de réfuter l'hypothèse que Nancy s'est administré elle-même le poison.
On a pensé à toutes les possibilités. Elle l'avait peut-être fait, ou elle avait peut-être ingéré l'arsenic accidentellement. Mais les médecins nous ont assuré que personne ne se suiciderait à l'arsenic. Elle a énormément souffert, c'était très douloureux. Ses organes ont cessé de fonctionner longtemps après l'ingestion. Le médecin légiste a dit que personne n'était capable de s'infliger ça.
L'accusation doit également expliquer la forte dose d'arsenic sur les ongles de Nancy.
D'après moi, et les médecins avaient l'air d'accord, elle a vomi. Et elle en a sûrement reçu sur les mains. L'arsenic contenu dans son vomi a pu augmenter le taux de poison sur ses ongles.
L'accusation fait ensuite témoigner un expert graphologique pour analyser les notes de Nancy.
L'écriture était légèrement différente entre les phrases sur l'inceste et les autres phrases.
Nancy et Richard ont étudié ensemble. Ils avaient appris à imiter l'écriture de l'autre pour pouvoir faire les devoirs de l'autre. Si on compare leurs écritures, elles sont très semblables. Mais l'expert graphologique du FBI a pu déterminer qu'elle n'avait pas écrit ces notes. Il s'agissait de faux.
Il était sûr et certain que les notes sur l'inceste avaient été écrites par Richard Lyon.
L'accusation réserve une dernière surprise. Charles Koch retourne à la barre pour dire au jury que la facture tapée à la machine ne vient pas de son entreprise.
Il remplissait toujours ses factures à la main, jamais à la machine.
Quelqu'un avait copié l'entête de l'entreprise sur une facture vierge et avait ajouté la liste des produits chimiques. On aurait dit une vraie facture d'achat.
C'était un élément qui, à mon avis, et je n'étais pas la seule à le penser, était difficile à réfuter.
Le témoignage de Charles Koch prouvait qu'il y avait eu mensonge. Et les jurés ont horreur qu'on leur mente. Le mensonge est ce qu'il y a de pire.
Le jury a besoin de moins d'une heure pour décider d'un verdict.
Is that verdict, we, the jury, find the defendant Richard Allen Abu Lyon guilty as charged in the indictment. Okay, thank you.
Je crois que personne dans la salle n'a été surpris par le verdict, à part Richard Lyon. Il n'arrivait pas à croire qu'il avait été reconnu coupable.
Trois semaines plus tard, la condamnation est annoncée par le juge.
J'ai commencé à recevoir beaucoup de courriers. La plupart étaient en faveur d'une condamnation sévère. J'ai commencé à me demander comment quelqu'un pouvait acheter de l'arsenic et l'administrer régulièrement à sa femme, à la mère de ses enfants. Peu importe si un homme déteste sa femme et qu'il veut être avec une autre femme, il y a d'autres solutions comme le divorce. Et j'ai donc pensé qu'il méritait une condamnation sévère.
Richard est condamné à la prison à perpétuité, la peine maximale. La longue et douloureuse attente est enfin terminée pour Big Daddy et toute la famille Dillard.
C'est la famille de Nancy qui est allée voir la police pour lui faire part de ses soupçons. S'ils ne l'avaient pas fait, l'autopsie n'aurait jamais été pratiquée et personne n'aurait su qu'elle avait été empoisonnée.
Ils avaient des amis puissants et une grosse fortune. Ça les a certainement poussés à vouloir rendre justice pour leur fille. Plus que n'aurait pu le faire une famille moins fortunée.
Plus de 10 ans après, l'avocat de Richard continue de le défendre.
Mon grand-père disait toujours « ça me reste en travers de la gorge ». Au vu des preuves, je ne pense pas que Richard aurait dû être déclaré coupable. Les preuves médico-légales étaient très parlantes. Pourquoi les ongles de Nancy contenaient-ils autant d'arsenic? Ce n'est pas un détail.
J'ai rencontré M. Koch avant son témoignage. Et ça n'avait pas l'air d'être un souci à ce moment-là que la facture ne provienne pas de son entreprise. À mon avis, il avait peur d'avoir des problèmes pour avoir vendu ses produits chimiques. Il a témoigné pour se protéger.
Mais peu de gens dans les Park Cities s'émeuvent vraiment de la condamnation de Richard.
Richard Lyon était un homme froid. Et il se croyait supérieur aux autres. Il ne pensait pas qu'on le condamnerait. Il pensait s'en sortir en faisant des faux sans qu'on s'en rende compte.
Richard Lyon pensait être au-dessus des lois. C'était un homme intelligent, mais pas un meurtrier très malin.
Les gens comme Richard Lyon n'imaginent pas perdre leur niveau de vie. Ils veulent bien se débarrasser de leur femme, mais pas du niveau de vie qu'elle leur a permis d'obtenir.
Beaucoup de gens pensent que l'argent fait le bonheur et qu'il évite d'avoir des problèmes. Mais en fait, peu importe la fortune et l'école qu'on a fréquentée, on est tous humains et on peut tous tomber dans le piège d'un manque d'adaptation. Et c'est ce qui s'est passé dans cette affaire.
De tous les moyens de commettre un meurtre, l'empoisonnement demande une froideur particulière. Richard Lyon a regardé mourir lentement et dans la douleur une femme qu'il avait aimée. Dommage qu'il n'ait pas goûté lui-même à son poison. C'était Dominique Dunn. Merci de nous avoir suivis.
The vast expanse of the South Pacific Ocean has always held a dual nature in the human imagination. On one hand, it represents the ultimate paradise, a sprawling canvas of endless blue waters, pristine coral reefs, and lush, volcanic islands completely detached from the frantic pace of modern civilization. It is a place where time seems to slow down, where the trade winds offer a gentle respite from the world beyond the horizon. But on the other hand, this exact same isolation carries a profound and terrifying undercurrent. When you are separated from the rest of humanity by thousands of miles of deep, unforgiving ocean, the isolation that once felt peaceful can rapidly transform into an inescapable prison. Geography itself becomes the perfect accomplice to exploitation. It is within this profound isolation, specifically within the American unincorporated territory of American Samoa, that one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters in the history of modern United States federal justice unfolded. This is not a story of a single act of violence committed in the heat of passion, nor is it the tale of a conventional serial killer stalking victims in the shadows. Instead, it is a meticulously orchestrated nightmare of human trafficking, a sprawling enterprise of forced labor, and an unimaginable campaign of physical and psychological terror enacted upon hundreds of vulnerable individuals who simply sought a better life. The village of Tafuna sits on the island of Tutuila, the main island of American Samoa. To the outside observer in the late 1990s, Tafuna might have seemed like a quiet, developing tropical community, characterized by its proximity to the international airport and its gradual shift towards light industry and commerce. It was here, beneath the swaying palm trees and the watchful gaze of the surrounding mountains, that a South Korean businessman named Kil-soo Lee decided to establish his empire. He named his enterprise the Daiwa Garment Factory. On paper, and to the local authorities who welcomed the promise of economic development, Daiwa appeared to be a standard manufacturing operation, a testament to globalized industry reaching even the most remote corners of the Pacific. It represented jobs, export revenue, and the integration of American Samoa into the lucrative international textile supply chain. However, behind the corrugated metal walls and the heavily guarded perimeter of the Daiwa compound, a vastly different reality was being engineered. Kil-soo Lee was not merely an entrepreneur navigating the complexities of global trade. He was the architect of a modern-day slave camp, operating with an audacity and ruthlessness that would eventually shock the highest echelons of the American legal system. The victims of this elaborate trap were over 250 workers, the overwhelming majority of whom were young women traveling from Vietnam, alongside a smaller contingent of workers from China. To understand the sheer cruelty of this tragedy, one must first understand the profound vulnerability of these individuals and the immense weight of the hopes they carried across the ocean. In the late 1990s, the prospect of securing employment under the jurisdiction of the United States, even in a remote overseas territory, was an incredibly powerful lure. Kil-soo Lee and his network of recruiters capitalized precisely on this desperation and ambition. They painted a vivid, irresistible picture for these women, promising them stable employment, fair wages, and a legitimate pathway to elevate themselves and their impoverished families out of economic hardship. For many of these women, signing a contract to work at the Daiwa factory meant mortgaging their futures, taking on significant debts, and leaving behind everything they knew and loved. They boarded flights crossing the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean not just as laborers, but as primary breadwinners, carrying the weight of their family's survival on their shoulders. Yet, the illusion of this American dream evaporated the very moment their feet touched the volcanic soil of American Samoa. The descent into subjugation was not a gradual decline, but an immediate and violent severance of their basic human rights. Upon their arrival at the factory compound in Tafuna, the workers were systematically stripped of their autonomy. Their passports, identification papers, and return tickets were swiftly and forcibly confiscated by the factory management. In an instant, they were rendered stateless and entirely dependent on the very people who intended to exploit them. Stripped of their documents on a tiny island thousands of miles from their homeland, escape became a physical and bureaucratic impossibility. The factory gates closed behind them, effectively sealing them within a jurisdiction of absolute tyranny where the laws of the United States seemed to hold no power, and the decrees of Kill Sue Lee became the only ruling authority. The living conditions inside the Daiwa compound were designed to break the human spirit. The workers were confined to squalid, overcrowded barracks that lacked even the most fundamental standards of hygiene and decency. They were subjected to a life of severe deprivation, frequently denied adequate food, and forced to endure conditions that fostered illness and despair. The promise of fair wages, the entire reason they had undertaken this perilous journey, was completely abandoned. The women toiled endlessly behind sewing machines, producing garments for international markets, while their own bodies withered from malnutrition and exhaustion, receiving absolutely no compensation for their agonizing labor. They were prisoners in every sense of the word, entirely cut off from the outside world, unable to speak the local language, unable to contact their families, and entirely at the mercy of a management structure that viewed them not as human beings, but as disposable machinery. The psychological toll of this existence was immense, but it was merely the baseline of their suffering. The physical violence utilized to maintain control over this captive workforce was brutal and unrelenting. Kill Sue Lee established a regime of terror, employing a cadre of local guards and enforcers to ensure strict compliance. These enforcers, numbering roughly around 20, operated with the explicit blessing and encouragement of their employer to use whatever means necessary to suppress dissent and force production. As the months dragged on, the factory transformed into an environment of constant fear, where minor infractions or simply failing to meet impossible production quotas could result in severe physical retribution. The workers were trapped in a cycle of starvation, exhaustion, and the perpetual threat of assault. The culmination of this systematic abuse reached its horrifying apex on the 28th of November, 1999. The catalyst for this explosion of unprecedented violence was a mundane business failure. A large international shipment of garments had fallen behind schedule. The economic pressure of this delayed order caused the thin veneer of corporate legitimacy to shatter entirely, revealing the unadulterated savagery of Kill Sue Lee's operation. Driven by the financial implications of the missed deadline, he made a decision that would cement his operation as a site of historical atrocity. He gathered his local enforcers and issued a directive that essentially authorized a localized massacre. He instructed his guards to utilize absolute and unrestrained violence against any worker who failed to comply, explicitly assuring his enforcers that he would bear the full responsibility even if their brutal actions resulted in the death of the women. This decree stripped away any remaining restraint, granting the guards a horrifying mandate of impunity. What followed was a scene of unimaginable carnage within the confines of the factory. The 20 enforcers, armed with heavy, rigid polyvinyl chloride pipes, descended upon the defenseless, starving workforce. They launched a coordinated and savage assault against the female workers, striking them indiscriminately with the hard plastic pipes. The confined spaces of the factory floor became a landscape of sheer terror as the women, weakened by months of abuse and malnutrition, desperately tried to shield themselves from the devastating blows. The violence was not meant merely to punish, but to completely subjugate and physically break the workforce. The heavy pipes shattered bones, caused severe lacerations, and inflicted profound internal injuries. The air was filled with the sounds of blunt force impacts and the screams of trapped victims who had absolutely nowhere to run. The aftermath of this calculated assault was devastating. Numerous workers sustained critical, life-altering injuries, both physical and psychological. In one particularly horrific instance, highlighting the sheer ferocity of the attack, A young Vietnamese woman was struck with such immense force that she suffered catastrophic trauma to her face, resulting in the permanent destruction and loss of one of her eyes. Witnesses who survived the ordeal and those who later investigated the scene struggled to find the vocabulary to articulate the sheer scale of the brutality, frequently describing the events of that day not as a labor dispute or a riot, but as a systematic massacre executed against a captive and defenseless population. The factory floor was stained with the blood of women whose only transgression was seeking an honest living. This catastrophic event on the 28th of November, 1999, stands as the grim centerpiece of the Daiwa tragedy. It represents the ultimate intersection of corporate greed, human vulnerability, and the catastrophic failure of local oversight. For an agonizing period following the assault, it appeared as though this atrocity might simply be swept under the rug, hidden away in the deep Pacific, obscured by bureaucratic delays and the geographical isolation of American Samoa. The local authorities, ill-equipped or perhaps unwilling to confront the magnitude of the crime occurring in their own backyard, moved with a painful sluggishness that only compounded the suffering of the victims. The women remained trapped, broken, and terrified, entirely unsure if the outside world would ever learn of their existence or the horrors they had endured. However, the sheer scale of the violence and the undeniable evidence of widespread human trafficking eventually pierced the veil of isolation. The profound severity of the situation, coupled with the fact that these crimes were occurring on United States territory, eventually triggered a massive federal response. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was compelled to intervene, crossing the ocean to dismantle the operation and rescue the surviving workers from their tormentors. The subsequent investigation would unravel a complex web of deceit, exploitation, and extortion, ultimately leading to the arrest of Kil-Soo Lee in the year 2001. To ensure a fair and rigorous judicial process free from local influence, he was extradited across the ocean to the state of Hawaii, where the full weight of the federal justice system would finally be brought to bear against him. The ensuing legal battle culminated in the year 2005, resulting in a landmark conviction. Kil-Soo Lee was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, found guilty on severe charges encompassing human trafficking, forced labor, and extortion. While this sentence represented a monumental victory for federal prosecutors and a measure of justice for the survivors, the legacy of the Daiwa factory extends far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The case served as a brutal awakening for the United States government and the international community, laying bare the terrifying reality that modern slavery could thrive within the supply chains of everyday products, even under the shadow of the American flag. It became a pivotal catalyst for sweeping legislative reform, fundamentally shaping the creation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the year 2000, a landmark piece of legislation designed to safeguard immigrant laborers from precisely the kind of exploitation endured by the women of Daiwa. Furthermore, it stood as a tragic and enduring lesson for nations exporting labor, highlighting the desperate need for rigorous oversight to protect their most vulnerable citizens from falling prey to international syndicates of exploitation. But before the legislation, before the federal trials, and before the rescue, there was simply the island, the factory, and the terrifying realization of hundreds of women that they had walked willingly into a meticulously designed nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. This is the story of how that nightmare was built, how it violently erupted, and the arduous path required to finally bring it to an end. The late 1990s in Vietnam was a period defined by profound economic transition and a desperate yearning for upward mobility. While the nation was beginning to open its doors to the global market, the benefits of this newfound economic liberalization were starkly uneven, leaving the vast agrarian hinterlands largely untouched. For the countless families residing in the rural provinces, daily life remained an exhausting struggle for basic survival. It was within these impoverished communities that the concept of labor export began to take root not merely as an option, but as an absolute necessity. Sending a family member overseas to work was viewed as the ultimate sacrifice to lift an entire household out of generational poverty. The victims of the Daiwa tragedy were primarily women drawn from exactly these vulnerable circumstances. In the traditional cultural fabric, the burden of filial piety often falls disproportionately on the shoulders of the daughters and mothers. When medical bills accumulated or the harvest failed, these young women were expected to sacrifice their own comfort for the collective survival of their kin. The prospect of earning highly coveted United States dollars represented a life-altering opportunity to save their families. To fully grasp the insidious nature of the trap laid by Kil Soo Lee, one must deeply understand the immense financial investment required for these women to embark on this journey. The recruitment process was a complex, highly predatory system designed to extract maximum profit from the most desperate individuals before they even left their home country. To secure a position at the Daiwa factory in American Samoa, these women were required to pay exorbitant recruitment fees that were utterly incomprehensible to families surviving on mere dollars a month. They were forced into a perilous cycle of debt, mortgaging their meager plots of ancestral land and borrowing heavily from predatory local lenders at crippling interest rates. This staggering financial burden effectively chained the women to their overseas employment long before they ever boarded an airplane. They departed their home villages knowing with absolute certainty that failure was not an option. If they returned home empty-handed, the debt would completely consume their families, leading to permanent financial destitution. This terrifying fear of failing their loved ones was the invisible but unbreakable chain that Kil Soo Lee would exploit with devastating efficiency. The recruiters acting on behalf of the Daiwa factory masterfully manipulated these aspirations, painting a meticulously crafted illusion of the American dream. The destination they were promised was American Samoa. To the women sitting in small recruitment offices in Vietnam, the intricacies of United States territorial law and the geographical realities of the South Pacific were unknown concepts. All they heard were the words American and United States territory. They were promised a modern, well-regulated working environment governed by robust labor standards, comfortable living quarters, and a continuous flow of income. The brochures completely masked the dark, unregulated underbelly that Kil Soo Lee had deliberately constructed. Alongside the Vietnamese majority, a smaller but equally vulnerable group of workers from China was also drawn into this sophisticated web of deceit. Driven by similar economic pressures, they bound themselves to the Daiwa enterprise. Despite linguistic barriers, they shared a profound and tragic commonality as economic refugees willing to endure severe hardship in exchange for a dignified wage. They were united by their desperation, their heavy debts, and their absolute reliance on the integrity of their employer, a reliance that was commodified and weaponized against them. The physical journey from the rural landscapes of Asia to the remote islands of American Samoa was an exhausting and disorienting ordeal. For the vast majority of these women, this was the first time they had ever left their home provinces. They navigated unfamiliar international airports, endured long flights across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, and experienced the profound psychological dislocation of being completely unmoored from everything they knew. As the airplanes descended towards the island of Tutuila, the sheer isolation of their new reality began to materialize. American Samoa is a small, intensely isolated volcanic archipelago surrounded by thousands of miles of deep blue ocean. This geographical isolation was not a coincidental detail. It was a fundamental component of Kil Soo Lee's strategy of control. In a mainland city, an exploited worker might eventually find an avenue for escape. But on a tightly knit island territory, the ocean itself acted as an insurmountable prison wall. Even if a worker managed to flee the factory compound, there was nowhere to run and absolutely no way to return home. They were marooned in a tropical paradise rapidly transforming into an engineered hell. The illusion of the American dream was shattered with brutal efficiency almost immediately upon their arrival at the factory compound in the village of Tafuna. The transition from hopeful, debt-burdened migrants to captive laborers was neither gradual nor subtle. It was executed through a swift and calculated administrative process designed to instantly strip the women of their identity, their autonomy, and their legal standing. As soon as they entered the Daiwa facility, the management implemented their primary mechanism of control. The workers were ordered to surrender their passports, their identification documents, and their return airline tickets under the guise of administrative safekeeping. In reality, the confiscation of their documents severed their only legal tether to the outside world. Without their passports, they ceased to be documented guest workers. They were instantly reduced to the status of undocumented captives, entirely dependent on the goodwill of the people who had orchestrated their entrapment. The realization that the exit doors had been firmly locked behind them washed over the workers with a terrifying finality. The promises of comfortable conditions evaporated, replaced by the stark reality of the corrugated metal walls that surrounded them. The immediate environment they were thrust into further confirmed their darkest fears. Instead of the clean, regulated dormitories they had been promised, the women were corralled into squalid, intensely overcrowded barracks. The living conditions were deliberately kept at a level of severe deprivation, designed to systematically break down the physical and mental resilience of the workforce. They were forced to exist in a state of constant physical discomfort, subjected to inadequate sanitation, poor ventilation, and a pervasive lack of privacy. The food provided to them was scarce, nutritionally deficient, and sometimes entirely withheld as a form of collective punishment. The basic human right to adequate sustenance was weaponized as an additional tool of control. But the most devastating betrayal, the one that triggered the deepest waves of panic and despair among the workforce, was the sudden realization that they were not going to be paid. The entire foundation of their sacrifice, the massive debts they had accrued, and the immense hopes of their families rested entirely on the promise of regular wages. Yet, as the weeks turned into months of grueling, relentless labor behind the sewing machines, the promised paychecks never materialized. Kil Soo Lee's management team offered a continuous stream of fabricated excuses, citing delayed shipments and vague bureaucratic hurdles. The women were forced to work exhausting shifts entirely uncompensated, while the crushing weight of the interest on their debts back home continued to multiply exponentially. This systematic theft of their wages plunged the workers into a state of profound psychological torment. They were acutely aware that every day they spent trapped in the Daiwa factory without pay was a day their families slipped further into financial ruin. The fear of what was happening to their loved ones back in Vietnam and China became a constant, agonizing hum in the back of their minds. They were paralyzed by a complex web of terror and impossible choices. If they protested the lack of pay, they risked severe physical retaliation from the brutal guards who constantly patrolled the perimeter of the factory compound. If they somehow managed to escape the heavily fortified walls, they would simply be undocumented aliens wandering on a small, remote island, completely unable to earn the money required to save their families from the ruthless predatory lenders waiting patiently back home. They were trapped in a paradox of exploitation, entirely unable to stay and endure the abuse, yet entirely unable to leave without condemning their families to generational ruin. Kil Soo Lee understood this psychological paralysis perfectly and wielded it with precision. He knew that the massive debts the women carried were stronger and more restrictive than any physical chain or locked door. He exploited their deep love for their families, their fear of failure, and their total lack of legal recourse to extract an atmosphere of absolute submission. The Daiwa factory devolved into an ecosystem of total human exploitation, a desolate place where human beings were consumed, broken, and discarded solely to maximize the profit margins of international apparel contracts. The hundreds of women from Vietnam and China had traveled across the vast expanse of the globe seeking a legitimate, dignified pathway to a better life, only to find themselves tragically ensnared in a highly sophisticated, meticulously organized system of modern-day slavery operating brazenly on sovereign American soil. Their multifaceted identities as devoted daughters, loving mothers, and hopeful dreamers were violently and methodically stripped away by the factory administration. In the wake of this systematic dehumanization, all that remained was the exhausting, inescapable reality of endless, completely uncompensated manual labor, the severe deterioration of their physical health, and the looming, ever-present threat of catastrophic, unimaginable violence that was slowly building pressure within the compound, a dark storm of brutality that would soon, inevitably, erupt upon them all. The transition of the Daiwa factory from an engine of economic exploitation to an active, violent dungeon was a process that mirrored the escalating desperation of its proprietor, Kil Soo Lee. While the initial months were defined by the psychological crushing of the workers, the systematic theft of their passports, the denial of wages, and the forced confinement in squalid, unsanitary barracks, the atmosphere within the compound eventually reached a volatile breaking point. The factory was a pressure cooker where the combination of intense physical exhaustion, severe malnutrition, and the mounting, suffocating anxiety over unpaid wages and predatory debts created an environment of permanent, low-level instability. The workers, though physically broken by their grueling shifts, were becoming increasingly aware of the utter hopelessness of their situation. This awareness was not merely a matter of personal suffering, it was a realization that their sacrifice had been a complete, calculated fraud. As the months of labor without compensation stretched on, the silence of the factory floor, once characterized by the rhythmic hum of sewing machines, began to be punctuated by the quiet whispers of terrified, desperate women who realized they had been sold into a living nightmare. Kil Soo Lee's management style was built upon the maintenance of this fear. He understood that in order to extract maximum labor from a workforce that knew it was being cheated, he had to instill a sense of absolute, overwhelming terror. To achieve this, he had recruited a cadre of local enforcers, a group of approximately 20 individuals from the surrounding island community. These men were chosen not for their industrial expertise or their administrative capabilities, but for their willingness to exert raw, physical force upon the women. By utilizing local enforcers, Lee created a deliberate buffer between himself and the direct execution of violence, a strategic layer of separation that he hoped would insulate him from direct accountability while ensuring that the discipline within the compound was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. These guards were instructed to maintain order at any cost, and over time, their presence transitioned from mere surveillance to active, systematic intimidation. They walked the aisles of the factory with heavy, intimidating gazes, carrying themselves with the authority of men who knew that the laws of the outside world, or at least the enforcement of those laws, were suspended within the corrugated metal walls of Daiwa. The friction that ultimately triggered the explosion of violence on November 28, 1999, was rooted in the cold, unfeeling demands of international commerce. A significant, high-value shipment of garments had fallen behind schedule, threatening the factory's precarious financial standing and, more importantly, the personal profits and ego of Kil Soo Lee. For an entrepreneur like Lee, the workers were not individuals with rights, hopes, or physical limitations. They were line items in a ledger, disposable components in a machine. When the production quotas were not met, he did not view it as a failure of management or a consequence of the starvation wages he provided. He viewed it as an act of defiance, a personal insult from a group of people he considered entirely beneath him. The delayed shipment became the catalyst for him to cast aside any remaining pretense of corporate legality and unleash the full, unadulterated extent of his cruelty. He did not simply push the workers to work faster. He decided to crush the spirit of any potential resistance through an act of overwhelming, public violence that would serve as a terrifying, permanent warning to every woman in the compound. On the morning of that fateful Sunday, the factory floor was heavy with an unnatural tension. The guards, seemingly emboldened by a new sense of urgency from the management office, were unusually aggressive. Kil Soo Lee summoned his enforcers and, in a display of cold, calculated malice, issued his direct order. He did not couch his demands in corporate euphemisms or vague instructions. He was blunt, explicit, and utterly indifferent to the human consequences. He told them that they were to beat anyone who failed to comply, anyone who slowed down, or anyone who dared to show signs of defiance. He declared that he would take full responsibility for their actions, even if their brutality led to the death of the workers. This statement was the final piece of the puzzle that turned the factory into a slaughterhouse. By providing his enforcers with a blanket guarantee of impunity, Lee had effectively authorized a localized, internal massacre. He had weaponized the guards, turning them from supervisors into conduits for his own unrestrained sadism, confident that the isolation of the island would protect him from the consequences of his commands. The violence that followed was not a riot or a spontaneous flare-up of tempers. It was a choreographed, systematic assault. The enforcers entered the main production area, and the air immediately filled with the sharp, sickening sound of rigid, thick polyvinyl chloride pipes striking human flesh. The women, already weakened by months of inadequate caloric intake and relentless labor, were completely defenseless. The pipes, which had been sourced as tools for the factory, were now used as instruments of torture. The guards moved with a coordinated, ruthless efficiency, striking the women across their backs, limbs, and torsos, forcing them to continue working even as they collapsed under the weight of the blows. The screams of the women echoed off the metal walls, but there was nowhere for them to retreat. The exits were blocked, the perimeter was secured, and the surrounding island remained oblivious to the carnage taking place within the compound. The scene was described by those who witnessed the horror as nothing short of a massacre, a systematic attempt to break the humanity of the workforce through sheer, overwhelming physical pain. As the assault continued throughout the day, the level of violence escalated to a truly grotesque level. The guards were no longer just disciplining. They were inflicting life-altering injuries with total abandon. The brutality was concentrated, intense, and meant to be witnessed by every other worker in the room to ensure maximum psychological impact. One young Vietnamese woman, who had been a model of diligence despite the atrocious conditions, was singled out for an act of particular savagery. A guard swung a heavy, thick pipe with such focused force that it struck her directly in the face, causing immediate, catastrophic trauma. The impact shattered bone and tissue, resulting in the permanent destruction of her eye and leaving her with an injury that would serve as a lifelong, visual testament to the terror of that day. She was left on the floor, bleeding and in agonizing pain, while the work continued around her under the watchful, menacing eyes of the enforcers. Many other women suffered deep lacerations, broken limbs, and severe contusions that would leave them permanently scarred, both physically and psychologically. The sight of their peers being systematically beaten, the knowledge that any one of them could be next, and the overwhelming realization that their employer was willing to commit murder to keep them in bondage shattered the last remnants of the women's ability to resist. The factory floor was transformed into a landscape of broken, sobbing human beings who continued to sew because they were too terrified to stop. The silence that fell over the room after the initial, deafening chaos was perhaps the most haunting aspect of the entire day. It was a heavy, suffocating silence of total, forced submission. The workers realized that they were entirely alone, abandoned by the governments who had signed their labor contracts, trapped on a remote island by a man who had explicitly authorized their killing, and surrounded by guards who were all too happy to obey his orders. The event of November 28th was not just a singular act of violence. It was the definitive moment in the Daiwa tragedy where the illusion of legality was stripped away, revealing the naked, brutal truth of the slave camp that had been built on American soil. The trauma of that day would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, a nightmare that seemed to have no end, as the sun set over the island of Tutuila and left them in the dark, trapped with their tormentors and the agonizing physical reminders of the violence that had been visited upon them by a man who considered them nothing more than inventory to be managed, broken, and ultimately discarded. The aftermath of the November 28th massacre at the Daiwa factory created a temporal void where the horror of the event collided with the agonizing inertia of the local legal and political systems. For the survivors, the days following the violence were a blur of physical pain, profound psychological shock, and a paralyzing sense of abandonment. Their bodies were covered in the dark, purple bruises and jagged welts left by the PVC pipes, while their minds remained locked in the moment of the assault, replaying the sounds of the strikes and the visceral screams of their colleagues. The factory itself had become a site of concentrated trauma, yet the work continued with a chilling, mechanical relentlessness. Kil Su Lee, far from being deterred by the brutality, seemed further emboldened. He moved through the facility with the arrogance of a man who believed he had successfully tested the limits of his power and found that there were no consequences. The enforcers, now transformed into permanent agents of state-sanctioned terror, monitored the workers with an increased intensity, their presence serving as a constant reminder that the violence of the 28th could be repeated at any moment with even greater severity. In the immediate wake of the violence, the plight of the workers was trapped behind the complex, often impenetrable geography of American Samoan jurisdiction. The territory, while technically under the oversight of the United States, operated with a degree of local autonomy that often left federal authorities at a significant distance. The local government and law enforcement, either through a lack of resources, systemic corruption, or an uncomfortable deference to the perceived economic necessity of the factory, initially displayed an alarming lack of urgency in addressing the allegations of abuse. The cries for help from the survivors were, for a period, silenced by a wall of bureaucratic indifference. This phase of the tragedy remains one of the most maddening aspects of the entire affair. The victims were physically present, their injuries were undeniable, and their testimony was harrowing, yet the wheels of justice refused to turn. They were living in a paradox where the protection of American law was theoretically their right, yet in the practical, daily reality of their confinement in Tafuna, that law seemed entirely absent, failing to acknowledge their suffering or hold their tormentors to account. The intervention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not come as a swift, cavalry-like rescue, but rather as the result of the inevitable, slow-building pressure caused by the sheer magnitude of the crime. As news of the conditions began to slowly trickle out from the compound, often through the immense courage of individuals who risked everything to contact outside organizations or through the sheer visibility of the survivors' injuries, the federal authorities could no longer look away. The transition from local inaction to federal intervention was a protracted process, characterized by the meticulous gathering of evidence. Federal investigators had to navigate a landscape where intimidation was the primary language. The survivors, who had been conditioned to view every authority figure as a potential enemy and who lived under the constant threat of retaliation against their families back in Asia, were initially terrified to speak. They had been told that if they revealed the truth, the consequences would be catastrophic, and they had seen the violence that corroborated these threats. Breaking this cycle of silence required a level of patience and empathy that went beyond standard police work. The agents had to prove to these women that the federal government was not just an extension of the same power structure that had exploited them, but a force capable of guaranteeing their safety and dismantling the apparatus of their enslavement. The investigation itself was a grueling process of documenting the systemic nature of the exploitation. It was not merely enough to prove that an assault had occurred. The prosecution needed to build a case that encompassed the entire spectrum of human trafficking. They needed to map the journey of the women from their home villages, document the predatory recruitment fees, catalog the confiscation of their passports, and record the systematic wage theft that underpinned the factory's profitability. Each piece of evidence was a testament to a deliberate, calculated, and long-term criminal enterprise. Every document recovered, every statement taken from a survivor, and every internal record of the Daiwa factory served to strip away the thin veneer of legitimacy that Kil Soo Lee had tried to maintain. The investigators uncovered a world of financial manipulation where the very act of bringing these women to the island was a profit-making endeavor, with the labor itself being secondary to the extortion of the debt-trapped workers. The depth of the depravity was staggering, revealing that the violence on the factory floor was not an anomaly, but a necessary instrument in a larger, darker mechanism of modern bondage. The turning point in the investigation arrived when the testimonies of the survivors began to coalesce into a cohesive, undeniable narrative of institutionalized cruelty. The young woman who had lost her eye, along with scores of others who bore the physical and psychological scars of their time in Tafuna, found the strength to testify despite the lingering, deep-seated fear of their former master. Their stories were consistent, graphic, and devastatingly human. As the federal case gained momentum, the structural supports of Kil Soo Lee's empire began to collapse. The realization that they were no longer dealing with a localized labor dispute but with a major federal human trafficking case meant that the resources and authority of the United States government were now fully focused on the pursuit of justice. The logistical challenge of managing such a large group of witnesses, many of whom were victims of severe trauma and had limited legal status, required a monumental effort. The federal government had to provide support, housing, and legal counsel for hundreds of individuals who had been rendered stateless by the confiscation of their passports. This period of the investigation was marked by an intense focus on victim protection, a recognition that the survivors were not just witnesses in a trial, but individuals whose lives had been shattered and who needed to be shielded from the trauma of the judicial process. Throughout this period, Kil-Soo Lee and his defense attempted to obscure the reality of their actions through a variety of tactics, ranging from legal maneuvers to the continued, subtle intimidation of those who stood against them. However, the sheer weight of the federal investigation proved impossible to counteract. By the time the case was ready for trial, the evidence of his role as the primary architect of this slave camp was overwhelming. The decision to remove him from the territory of American Samoa and relocate the proceedings to the federal court in Hawaii was a strategic necessity. It ensured that the trial would be conducted in a venue where the potential for local, extra-legal interference was minimized, providing a neutral ground where the rule of law could finally be asserted. This transition of the legal battlefield was perhaps the most crucial step in ensuring that the trial would not be compromised by the same factors that had allowed the abuse to continue for so long in Tafuna. The move to Hawaii also signaled to the survivors that they were now under the full protection of the American judicial system, far removed from the isolated, dangerous environment of the factory compound. It allowed the prosecution to present their case in a standard federal forum where the rules of procedure, the presence of the media, and the oversight of a federal judge provided a stark contrast to the closed, shadow world of the Daiwa facility. The investigators and prosecutors spent months preparing, ensuring that every detail was accounted for, from the medical records of the injured to the financial ledgers that detailed the illicit profits. They were building a case that would not just result in a conviction but would serve as a permanent legal record of the crimes committed, a document of truth that would stand against any future attempts to minimize or deny the atrocities. As the trial date approached, the focus remained on the victims, ensuring that their voices would be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The quiet strength of these women, who had been brought to their knees by unimaginable cruelty and had fought their way through it, would become the ultimate, insurmountable barrier to Kil-Soo Lee's efforts to escape the consequences of his actions. Their journey from the rural provinces of Asia to the federal courtroom in Honolulu was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a long and arduous path that was nearing its final, definitive destination. The investigation had been long, the path to justice had been fraught with obstacles, but the foundation for a landmark moment in the history of American justice had finally been firmly laid. The federal courthouse in Honolulu served as the stage for the final reckoning, a stark, antiseptic environment that stood in profound contrast to the hot, humid, and terror-filled factory floor in Tafuna. For the victims of the Daiwa tragedy, the journey to Hawaii represented far more than a simple change of venue. It was the transition from the status of property to the status of plaintiffs, from the voiceless captives of a madman to the central witnesses in a historic federal trial. The courtroom was packed with representatives from the media, human rights advocates, and federal officials, all gathered to witness the unraveling of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for far too long. Kil-Soo Lee, who had once held absolute power over the lives of hundreds, now sat at the defense table, stripped of his authority and forced to confront the individuals he had dehumanized. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with the weight of the testimonies that were about to be heard, a collective gravity born from years of suppressed trauma and the long-awaited arrival of accountability. The prosecution opened its case with a meticulous, narrative-driven presentation that traced the entire history of the Daiwa factory from its deceptive inception to the violent climax of November 28, 1999. They understood that to secure a conviction, they needed to humanize the statistics. They needed the jury to see not just a labor dispute or a business failure, but the individual lives that had been systematically dismantled. The courtroom became a space where the harrowing details of the captive's existence were articulated into the legal record. When the survivors began to take the stand, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. Their testimonies were not dramatic, theatrical performances. They were quiet, deliberate, and devastatingly honest accounts of their experiences. They spoke of the recruitment promises that had lured them from their homes, the visceral terror of the passport confiscations, and the daily, grinding reality of hunger and forced labor. Each witness added a layer of detail to the portrait of the factory, confirming the existence of the barracks, the lack of food, and the omnipresent threat of physical violence that had defined their lives in American Samoa. The highlight and most traumatic portion of the trial involved the testimonies regarding the events of November 28th. The prosecution presented the evidence of the assault with a cold, clinical precision, contrasting the brutal reality of the violence with the callous, detached nature of the orders given by Kil Soo Lee. When the survivors testified about the morning of the massacre, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. They described the arrival of the guards, the heavy PVC pipes, and the systematic, methodical nature of the beatings. The testimony of the young woman who had lost her eye was a profound moment of emotional gravity. As she recounted the moment the pipe struck her face, the jury was confronted with the physical reality of the cruelty that had been inflicted upon her. Her injuries served as an indelible, visual piece of evidence that no legal maneuver by the defense could ever obscure. The survivors, who had once been broken into submission by the fear of their employer, now stood tall, using the power of the truth to dismantle the very system of oppression that had once held them hostage. The defense for Kil Soo Lee attempted to deploy a variety of strategies to distance him from the direct violence, painting the factory as a high-pressure commercial environment where the management had lost control over a difficult and unruly workforce. They sought to portray the guards' actions as impulsive, localized events for which Lee could not be held directly responsible. However, this defense was systematically dismantled by the prosecution, which presented clear evidence of Lee's direct, active, and ongoing control over every facet of the factory's operations. They produced internal documents, records of communication, and witness statements that place Lee squarely at the center of the decision-making process. The prosecutors illustrated that the violence was not an aberration but a deliberate management tool, a fundamental component of the factory's business model. They demonstrated that Lee had explicitly provided his guards with the authority to use violence and had effectively created a vacuum of accountability where he could profit from the suffering of others while insulating himself from the repercussions of his decrees. The trial proceedings were a masterclass in the methodical application of federal law to a crime that had crossed the boundaries of international commerce, labor rights, and basic human dignity. As the days of testimony turned into weeks, the evidence became an insurmountable wall. The prosecution systematically built a case of human trafficking, forced labor, and extortion, connecting each individual act of abuse to the larger, central intent of the defendant. The jury, presented with a deluge of consistent, corroborated testimonies and physical evidence, was given a clear view into the dark, hidden ecosystem of the Daiwa compound. The defense's efforts to portray Lee as a misunderstood entrepreneur faded in the face of the overwhelming, factual reality of the crimes. The trial concluded not just with a condemnation of an individual, but with a firm, public affirmation of the rights of the victims. It was a victory for the rule of law, demonstrating that no matter how remote the location or how marginalized the victims might be, the federal justice system had the capacity to reach across the ocean and deliver accountability. The sentencing phase, which occurred in 2005, brought the legal process to its final, definitive conclusion. When the judge delivered the sentence of 40 years in federal prison for Kil Soo Lee, the courtroom reacted with a profound, quiet sense of relief. The sentence was a heavy, substantial punishment that reflected the severity of the crimes, the systematic nature of the trafficking, and the lasting, irreparable harm inflicted upon the survivors. It sent a powerful, unambiguous message to anyone who might consider utilizing such methods of exploitation in the global supply chain. For the survivors, the verdict was the validation of their suffering, a recognition that what had been done to them was not just a tragic mistake, but a serious crime against humanity. The long, arduous road that had begun in their rural villages continued through the gates of the Tafuna factory and traveled across the ocean to the federal court in Hawaii had finally reached its end. The judge's words were the final punctuation mark on a case that would remain a landmark in the history of American jurisprudence. Throughout the entire trial, the focus never wavered from the victims. Their resilience, their bravery in the face of their former tormentor, and their commitment to seeing justice served were the true driving forces behind the successful prosecution. They had navigated a legal system that was entirely foreign to them, translated their experiences through interpreters, and bore the heavy burden of reliving their trauma in a public forum. Yet, they did so with a dignity that commanded the respect of everyone in the courtroom. Their stories, once hidden away in the isolated barracks of American Samoa, were now part of the permanent record, a testament to the fact that their humanity could never be truly erased, no matter how hard their enslaver tried to break them. The trial in Hawaii was not just about the conviction of a single individual. It was a profound act of restorative justice that centered the voices of those who had been silenced. As the proceedings wrapped up and the final documents were signed, it was clear that the Daiwa case had fundamentally changed the landscape of labor rights and victim protections, establishing a new, higher standard for accountability that would influence the legal responses to future cases of human trafficking for generations to come. The nightmare that had begun in the remote village of Tafuna had been brought into the light, analyzed, dismantled, and officially condemned, providing a measure of closure for the hundreds of women whose lives had been forever altered by the tragedy. The closing of the legal chapter in the Daiwa tragedy did not mark the end of the narrative, but rather the beginning of a profound process of reflection and systemic evolution. As the echoes of the 40-year prison sentence for Kill Sue Lee faded from the Honolulu courtroom, the international community and the United States government were left to grapple with the haunting reality of what had occurred on the island of Tutuila. The Daiwa case was not an isolated aberration. It was a symptom of a deeply flawed global economic system that frequently prioritized profit margins over the fundamental dignity of the human beings producing the goods consumed in developed nations. The legacy of the factory in Tafuna is etched into the very fabric of how modern labor rights are understood, litigated, and protected today. It serves as a stark, permanent reminder that the distance between a corporate boardroom and the site of human bondage is often far shorter than one would like to believe. The tragedy fundamentally recalibrated the legal landscape, serving as a critical impetus for the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the year 2000, a landmark piece of legislation that remains the cornerstone of modern efforts to combat human trafficking. This legal shift was not merely a bureaucratic adjustment, but a seismic change in the moral and regulatory posture of the United States. Before the revelations of the Daiwa case, the mechanisms for identifying, reporting, and prosecuting such cases were fragmented, inconsistent, and often localized. The tragedy in American Samoa highlighted the urgent need for a cohesive, centralized federal approach that could overcome geographical and administrative barriers. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act provided the tools and the framework necessary to hold perpetrators accountable even when they operated across international borders or within the jurisdiction of remote territories. It established rigorous standards for victim support, emphasizing the necessity of providing survivors with the resources required to recover from the trauma of their exploitation. For the women who had endured the violence in the factory, the act was a belated recognition of their humanity and a commitment to ensuring that no other workers would be left to face such horrors in silence. It transformed the victims from anonymous, disposable laborers into protected individuals with rights that were enforceable, tangible, and defenseless against the reach of federal law. The case also provided an invaluable, albeit agonizing, lesson for the countries that were primary sources of exported labor. For nations like Vietnam, the tragedy was a profound awakening to the systemic risks faced by their citizens who sought opportunities abroad through unregulated or exploitative channels. It catalyzed a period of intense institutional self-reflection regarding the oversight, vetting, and protection of laborers traveling to work for international corporations. The tragedy underscored the necessity of robust governmental engagement with the conditions in which their citizens were employed, shifting the perspective from viewing labor export solely as an economic benefit to acknowledging it as a profound moral responsibility. The Daiwa tragedy forced countries to reconsider the vulnerability of their citizens and the role that international syndicates play in trapping them within systems of debt and violence. It served as a grim catalyst for improved bilateral agreements, stricter oversight of recruitment agencies, and the establishment of hotlines and support networks to assist those working far from home. Beyond the legislation and the policy changes, the enduring legacy of the Daiwa story lies in its profound impact on the human rights movement and the global consciousness surrounding modern slavery. It dismantled the comfort of the belief that such atrocities could only exist in the annals of history or in the most destabilized, war-torn regions of the world. By occurring in an unincorporated territory of the United States, the case shattered the geographic insulation of the American dream, proving that human rights abuses could thrive even under the protective umbrella of developed nations. It forced activists, policymakers, and consumers to look more critically at the supply chains of the products they used every day. The tragedy brought into sharp focus the reality that every garment, every item of clothing, and every product manufactured in the global economy is produced by human hands, and that without rigorous, independent oversight, those hands can easily be shackled. The case turned the spotlight on the hidden costs of cheap production and the true, human price of corporate greed. For the survivors, the path toward healing was an arduous, lifelong endeavor. The trauma of the November 28th massacre did not end with a guilty verdict in a court of law. It remained a persistent presence in their lives. The loss of dignity, the physical scars from the PVC pipes, and the emotional wreckage of their experience were challenges that required immense resilience to overcome. Many of the women returned to their home countries after the trial, carrying with them the heavy burden of their experiences, but also the hard-won strength of having stood up against their oppressor. They became symbols of resilience, proving that the human spirit, while capable of being broken by extreme malice, is also capable of profound recovery. Their collective courage was the most essential element of the entire ordeal. Without their testimony, the factory would have continued to operate in the shadows, and their voices would have been permanently silenced by the weight of their isolation. Their persistence transformed their victimization into a public demand for justice that no authority could ignore. As we reflect on the history of the Daiwa factory, it is vital to avoid the temptation to look back with a sense of detachment. The temptation to view this as a concluded chapter, a closed case in the records of history, ignores the ongoing, persistent nature of human exploitation in the global economy. The factors that allowed Kil Soo Lee to construct his prison, the extreme desperation of the workers, the lack of transparency in recruitment, the absence of accountability in remote locations, and the prioritization of profit, remain present today. The tragedy serves as an eternal, warning bell for every industry that depends on a transient, vulnerable workforce. It demands constant vigilance from governments, corporations, and civil society to ensure that the systems of modern global trade do not once again become conduits for modern slavery. We are tasked with the responsibility of ensuring that the memory of the women of Daiwa is not just a footnote in a legal textbook, but a guiding light for future policy and human rights activism. Ultimately, the Daiwa tragedy is a narrative about the power of the human conscience to eventually overcome the most entrenched and brutal systems of exploitation. It was a victory of truth over deception, of collective action over individual apathy, and of the fundamental dignity of the human being over the cold calculus of corporate greed. It teaches us that the protection of human rights is never a static, completed achievement, but a continuous process that requires the active, engaged commitment of every generation. It challenges us to look beyond the labels of the products we buy and to demand accountability from the systems that bring them to our shelves. It asks us to recognize the humanity of every individual, no matter how remote their location or how marginalized their status. The story of the hundreds of women who walked into the factory in Tafuna is, in the end, a story about the endurance of the human spirit. It is a story that started in the darkness of an isolated island and ended in the bright light of a public courtroom, forever shifting the discourse of global labor rights and reminding us all that we have a collective responsibility to protect those who are most vulnerable among us. As the years pass, the specific details of the trial may fade, but the fundamental lessons of the Daiwa factory, the necessity of justice, the value of transparency, and the imperative of protecting the most vulnerable, must remain as vivid as ever, ensuring that the legacy of those who suffered is one of progress, reform, and a renewed, global commitment to the dignity and freedom of every worker in the world. Their lives, once reduced to inventory, became the catalyst for a fundamental change that continues to protect laborers today, a testament to the fact that while their tormentors sought to erase their worth, they instead claimed their place in history, forcing the world to acknowledge their suffering and to act to ensure it would never, ever happen again. The ripples of the Daiwa tragedy extended far beyond the immediate conclusion of the trial and the legislative reforms that followed. As the years passed, the case became a foundational reference point for the study of modern human trafficking, serving as an enduring case study in how systemic exploitation hides in plain sight within the global supply chain. For the survivors, the narrative of their lives was irrevocably split into the time before the factory and the time after. The recovery process was not a linear trajectory but an ongoing, complex negotiation with the memory of the abuse. The psychological scars of their confinement, the constant surveillance, the arbitrary violence, and the crushing sense of isolation were not easily shed. Many survivors struggled for years with the long-term impacts of the trauma, necessitating dedicated support and mental health care to reintegrate into their communities. The global human rights community, observing the long-term healing of these individuals, recognized that justice was not limited to the sentencing of the perpetrator. It also necessitated a commitment to the long-term well-being and social reintegration of those who had been victimized. The legacy of the women is found not only in the changes to the law but in the strength they displayed in rebuilding their lives, their ability to voice their experiences in the face of immense trauma, and their role in educating the world about the realities of modern bondage. The scholarly and legal analysis of the Daiwa case continued to evolve, moving beyond the narrative of the crime itself to explore the broader systemic vulnerabilities that allowed such a tragedy to unfold in the first place. Experts in international law, labor rights, and sociology utilized the case to illustrate the dangers inherent in the intersection of unregulated labor migration and the aggressive drive for corporate profit. They identified the crucial role that geographical isolation plays in facilitating human rights abuses, noting how the remoteness of the American Samoan territory was not merely a factor of location but a strategic component of the entrapment. This insight paved the way for more sophisticated oversight frameworks, where the burden of proof is increasingly placed on corporations to demonstrate the ethical integrity of their supply chains, regardless of where they operate. The case became a standard example used to train federal investigators and labor inspectors, teaching them to look beyond the surface-level appearances of industrial facilities and to recognize the telltale signs of labor exploitation, from the confiscation of identification documents to the restriction of movement and the presence of coercive management structures. As the global discourse on human rights expanded to encompass the responsibilities of the private sector, the Daiwa tragedy provided the moral and legal authority to push for greater transparency and accountability. The concept of corporate social responsibility, once a largely performative exercise, began to be framed as an essential, enforceable obligation. Companies operating in the garment, agricultural, and extractive sectors were increasingly challenged to adopt rigorous, third-party auditing processes that could penetrate the layers of subcontractors and recruitment agencies that often shield firms from the reality of their workers' conditions. The lessons from the Tafuna factory were applied to these audits, informing the development of protocols that prioritize the testimony of workers themselves, acknowledging that they are the only reliable witnesses to their own living and working conditions. The tragic experience of the women in American Samoa effectively raised the bar for what constitutes a safe, ethical workplace, establishing a new global expectation that corporations must proactively ensure the dignity of every individual involved in their production processes, from the rural origin of the labor to the finished product on a store shelf. In the years following the trial, the village of Tafuna and the wider American Samoan community also underwent significant changes, prompted in part by the scrutiny that followed the exposure of the factory's crimes. The local government, cognizant of the international shame that the Daiwa tragedy brought upon the territory, began to implement more rigorous oversight of industrial developments and foreign investment. This shift toward greater regulatory responsibility was a direct response to the failure of the local authorities to address the initial reports of abuse. It became a point of civic realization that economic growth must be anchored in the respect for the law and the protection of basic human rights, or it becomes unsustainable and ultimately destructive. The story of the factory remains a part of the island's modern history, a somber reminder of the need for vigilance and the importance of fostering a community culture that rejects exploitation in all its forms. The impact of the Daiwa case also resonated within the Vietnamese and Chinese communities from which the workers originated. The tragedy sparked a national dialogue about the ethics of labor migration and the necessity of robust governmental protections for citizens employed abroad. Recruitment agencies and state-run labor programs faced increased pressure to implement transparent, ethical practices, with a renewed focus on ensuring that workers were fully informed of their rights and provided with accessible channels to report abuse. The story of the Daiwa survivors became a cautionary narrative for prospective migrants, highlighting the risks of relying on unverified recruitment networks and the importance of securing verifiable employment contracts. The commitment of these nations to safeguarding their citizens grew significantly, with the tragedy acting as a catalyst for the establishment of consular support systems and legal aid networks for migrant workers, ensuring that they were never again left to face such dire circumstances without the support of their home country. Looking back at the trajectory of this tragedy, it is clear that its significance lies not just in the horror of the event but in the profound, systemic transformation it triggered. The Daiwa case demonstrated that individual courage, when amplified by the machinery of the law and supported by international advocacy, has the power to hold even the most ruthless entities accountable. It proved that the dark, shadow worlds of modern slavery, no matter how carefully constructed, can be brought into the light through the persistence of those who refuse to be silenced. The memory of the women of Daiwa serves as a beacon, guiding the ongoing efforts of activists, lawyers, and policymakers who continue to fight for the rights of the vulnerable. It is a story that requires constant retelling, a vital piece of the historical record that underscores the perpetual struggle to uphold human dignity in a globalized world. The long-term impact on the individual lives of the survivors is perhaps the most enduring legacy of all. Their transformation from victims to advocates is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Many of them have used their experiences to work with NGOs, human rights organizations, and governmental bodies, providing their insights to help identify and stop other cases of human trafficking before they can escalate. They have turned their private trauma into a powerful public force for change, ensuring that their suffering was not in vain. The collective memory of their ordeal has become a foundational pillar for the modern anti-trafficking movement, influencing the way that victims are supported, the way that traffickers are prosecuted, and the way that global standards for labor are established. In the final analysis, the story of the Daiwa garment factory is a complex tapestry of human misery and human triumph. It is a narrative that begins with the calculated theft of freedom and ends with the long, difficult reclamation of dignity. It challenges us to look beyond our own comfort and to recognize our interconnectedness with the lives of the workers who manufacture the objects of our daily existence. The tragedy in American Samoa is not just a historical event to be studied, but a continuous responsibility to be upheld. It demands that we remain ever vigilant against the forces of exploitation, that we support the institutions that defend human rights, and that we listen to the voices of those who have been marginalized. As we consider the journey of the workers from their rural homes through the horrors of the factory to the justice of the federal court, we are reminded that the fight for freedom is never truly over. It is a battle that must be fought anew in every generation, with the memory of those who suffered at the hands of Kil Su Lee serving as our most potent and necessary guide. The legacy of the women of Daiwa is, in the end, one of profound resilience, a legacy that will continue to shape the world and defend the dignity of the human person long into the future, ensuring that the light of justice remains a permanent and necessary barrier against the encroaching darkness of greed and systemic cruelty. As the echoes of the Daiwa tragedy continue to resonate through the corridors of international labor law and human rights advocacy, the final reflections on this case must center on the enduring imperative of vigilance. The narrative of the Tafuna factory is not a closed book, but an open warning, a permanent entry in the ledger of global human rights that constantly reminds us of the fragility of the freedoms we often take for granted. The story, from the initial predatory recruitment in the quiet villages of Vietnam and China to the sterile, final conviction in a federal courthouse in Hawaii, serves as a comprehensive map of how exploitation functions in the modern era. It highlights that the mechanisms of modern slavery are not chaotic or disorganized, but are instead chillingly calculated, relying on the intersection of economic desperation, geographical isolation, and the deliberate dismantling of the human identity. To understand this legacy is to acknowledge that the potential for such atrocities exists wherever the pursuit of profit is allowed to proceed without the rigorous, unyielding constraints of moral and legal accountability. The institutional changes that were forged in the fire of the Daiwa case have created a more robust defense against similar crimes, yet the global economy remains a fertile ground for the resurgence of such exploitation. The ease with which global supply chains can obscure the conditions of production provides a perpetual temptation for unscrupulous actors to bypass the standards of dignity and fairness. This is why the memory of the women who suffered at the hands of Kil Sue Lee must remain a vivid, active force in the public consciousness. Their endurance, their vocal testimony, and their ultimate role in dismantling their oppressor's empire have established a precedent that the victims of such crimes are not merely objects of pity, but powerful witnesses whose voices hold the weight of historical truth. The anti-trafficking movement of today owes a significant debt to the bravery displayed by those who, in the aftermath of the November 28th massacre, chose to step out of the shadows and demand that the world bear witness to their suffering. Looking forward, the evolution of human rights protections must continue to adapt to the changing nature of the global workforce. The lessons of the Daiwa factory are directly applicable to the emerging challenges of the digital age, where the exploitation of labor can occur across even more vast and complex distances. The principles established by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the subsequent legal precedents must be vigorously defended and expanded to ensure that the protections afforded to workers are not diminished by technological or economic shifts. This requires a sustained commitment from governments to prioritize the rights of the migrant and the vulnerable over the interests of multinational corporations that seek to prioritize short-term profit at the cost of human lives. The struggle for justice is not a one-time endeavor that concludes with a single prison sentence. It is a permanent, ongoing effort to maintain a framework of human dignity that is respected and enforced in every corner of the world. The role of the consumer in this global dynamic cannot be overstated. The products that populate our daily lives are linked, through complex supply chains, to the people who manufacture them, and the refusal to accept goods produced through exploitation is a powerful tool for change. The Daiwa case forces us to confront the reality that our convenience often comes at an invisible, human price. By demanding transparency, by supporting ethical brands, and by staying informed about the conditions of labor, we can all contribute to an environment where the kind of atrocities committed in American Samoa become impossible to sustain. The tragedy has taught us that we are all, in a sense, connected to the labor that supports our lifestyles, and that this connection carries with it a moral obligation to ensure that no one is sacrificed to the altar of commerce. The memory of the workers in Tafuna is a call to action for every person to recognize their role in the global community and to use their influence to stand against the injustice of modern slavery. The academic study of the Daiwa tragedy will undoubtedly continue for many years, providing a foundational text for students of law, sociology, and international relations. It will serve as an essential resource for understanding the complexities of extraterritorial jurisdiction and the challenges of policing human rights abuses in remote or unincorporated territories. The case remains a beacon for those who work in the field of forensic human rights, offering deep insights into the importance of evidence-based advocacy and the power of survivor-centered judicial processes. As new generations of lawyers and activists emerge, they will turn to the records of this trial to learn how to bridge the gap between local victimization and federal accountability. The story of the women of Daiwa will thus continue to shape the future of human rights by providing a clear, enduring blueprint for how to confront and dismantle the systems that enable human bondage. In the final analysis, The significance of the Daiwa factory lies in its capacity to transform human suffering into systemic reform. The women who were once dehumanized as inventory were the very individuals who, through their resilience and testimony, forced a fundamental change in the way the international community perceives and combats human trafficking. Their journey is a testament to the fact that while the systems of power may seem insurmountable, they are ultimately composed of human decisions and can be challenged by human courage. The tragedy in Tafuna will forever be remembered as a moment when the world was forced to look at the dark, uncomfortable truths of the global economy and was compelled to act. It remains a powerful illustration of the resilience of the human spirit and the unwavering necessity of the pursuit of justice. The commitment to protect the vulnerable, to uphold the rule of law, and to honor the dignity of every worker is a responsibility that belongs to all of us, a legacy that we must continue to carry forward as we strive for a world free from the scourge of slavery. The memory of the women who stood in that factory and fought for their freedom is a light that continues to burn, illuminating the path toward a more equitable and just global future. Their story is a reminder that the cost of inaction is too high and that the protection of human dignity is a goal worth fighting for, regardless of the challenges or the distances involved. As we close the chapters on the specific details of the Daiwa case, we must keep the larger lessons at the forefront of our minds, ensuring that the progress made is not lost but built upon. The endurance of these survivors, their bravery in the face of insurmountable odds, and their contribution to the advancement of human rights are their true, permanent legacy. It is a legacy of empowerment, a call for eternal vigilance, and a testament to the fact that when we stand together against exploitation, we have the power to create a world where every individual is treated with the dignity and respect they inherently deserve. This is the ultimate, concluding truth of the Daiwa story, that justice, while often delayed and difficult to secure, remains the highest priority of a just society, and that the sacrifice of those who have suffered must serve as the foundation for the freedom of all who will follow in their footsteps, ensuring that the light of hope remains stronger than the darkness of oppression forevermore. The world is a different place because of the women who dared to fight for their lives in Tafuna, and the ongoing movement for human rights is their living, breathing monument, a promise that the lessons learned from their pain will be remembered, respected, and used as a guide to guard the dignity and freedom of every person in every nation for all the time to come. The final reflection on the Daiwa tragedy requires us to contemplate the intersection of memory and the evolving nature of global justice. As we look back from the vantage point of the present, the factory in Tafuna stands not merely as a site of historical trauma, but as a symbolic anchor for the modern anti-trafficking movement. The persistence of the survivors, who transitioned from the depths of dehumanization to become the primary architects of their own legal vindication, provides an enduring template for how marginalized individuals can reclaim their agency. Their ability to articulate the systemic nature of their suffering within the rigid confines of a federal courtroom challenged the prevailing legal paradigms of the late 90s, compelling the judiciary to recognize that human rights are not bound by geography, nor are they subordinate to the logistical requirements of international commerce. This shift in perception represents one of the most significant, if often overlooked, contributions of the Daiwa case to the ongoing struggle for global equality, as it fundamentally altered the baseline of accountability expected from those who engage in global labor exploitation. The legacy of the women is also deeply embedded in the professional culture of the institutions that were involved in their rescue and subsequent support. For the agents, attorneys, and victim advocates who worked on the case, the experience was a profound lesson in the necessity of cross-disciplinary cooperation. They learned that the fight against modern slavery requires a holistic approach, where the forensic gathering of evidence is paired with the psychological stabilization of the survivors and the legal protection of those who are at risk. This model of interagency collaboration has since become a standard procedure in the investigation of human trafficking, proving that the complexities of such crimes demand more than a traditional law enforcement response. The legacy of the survivors is thus woven into the operational protocols of modern justice, ensuring that the lessons learned from their pain are institutionalized and applied to prevent the repetition of such catastrophes. This evolution of practice is a silent but potent testimony to the resilience of those who, through their suffering, force the systems of power to become more responsive, more empathetic, and more effective. In the realm of international human rights advocacy, the Daiwa case continues to serve as an illustrative pillar for arguments regarding the responsibility of corporations to monitor their own supply chains. The narrative of Kill Sue Lee is frequently invoked to remind global business leaders that the absence of direct oversight does not equate to an absence of liability. The shift toward transparency, characterized by the rise of ethical auditing and sustainability reporting, is significantly indebted to the pressure generated by such high-profile revelations of abuse. The case effectively stripped away the pretense that industrial development could be divorced from the ethical responsibilities owed to the workers who drive that development. It established a moral and legal expectation that a company's reach into the furthest corners of the globe must be matched by a commitment to the safety and dignity of the individuals whose labor generates its profit. This transition from passive observation to active due diligence is a direct consequence of the public demand for accountability that began with the survivors of Tafuna. As we move further into the 21st century, the challenges to human dignity are shifting in form, yet the fundamental risks of exploitation remain constant. The digital transformation of global labor, while creating new avenues for economic participation, also introduces new vulnerabilities for workers who can be easily isolated or coerced through virtual and psychological means. The lessons of the Daiwa factory, the importance of checking the credentials of recruitment agencies, the necessity of maintaining communication with the outside world, and the power of collective action are more relevant today than ever before. We must ensure that the digital landscape does not become the new, invisible territory of isolation where modern forms of slavery can take root. The memory of the women of Daiwa acts as a compass, guiding our efforts to ensure that the advancements of the modern world do not facilitate the regression of human rights. It reminds us that technology and globalization are tools whose effects are determined by the ethical standards of those who use them, and that without constant, vigilant oversight, the exploitation of the most vulnerable is an ever-present risk. Furthermore, the social and cultural integration of the survivors into their home communities after the trial serves as a quieter, yet profoundly important, aspect of the case's legacy. Their return home was not the end of their story, but a new chapter in which they had to reconcile their experiences with their traditional societal roles. The courage required to reintegrate and to share their stories with their families and neighbors helped to dismantle the stigma that is often attached to survivors of human trafficking. By speaking openly, they empowered others in their communities to demand better protections and to be more discerning when presented with opportunities for foreign labor. Their lives became a vital source of education and advocacy, contributing to a more informed and resilient society that is better equipped to protect its own citizens from the deceptive tactics of global exploitation syndicates. This grassroots impact is a crucial part of the legacy, demonstrating that the struggle for justice is not only won in courtrooms, but also in the daily, courageous choices of survivors to live with dignity and to use their voices to prevent others from falling into the same trap. The story of the factory in Tafuna is ultimately a narrative of transformation, a transformation of the victims, a transformation of the law, and a transformation of the public conscience. It is a story that proves the worth of the individual life, regardless of their status or location, and confirms that the pursuit of justice, while fraught with difficulty, is an essential requirement of a functioning global society. As we reflect on the entirety of this history, we are tasked with the duty to ensure that the progress initiated by the bravery of these women is not stagnant, but continues to expand, addressing the new forms of vulnerability that emerge in our rapidly changing world. The commitment to human rights is a living commitment, one that requires daily participation and a refusal to be passive in the face of injustice. The legacy of the women is our shared responsibility. It is an inheritance that charges us with the mission of defending the weak, questioning the powerful, and refusing to accept that any individual should be treated as a disposable component in the machinery of profit. In closing, the legacy of the Daiwa factory is one of profound resilience and a mandate for eternal vigilance. We honor the survivors not just by remembering the horror of what they endured, but by committing ourselves to the preservation of the freedom they so dearly fought to regain. Their experience has become a foundational stone in the architecture of modern human rights, a permanent monument to the truth that justice is the ultimate defense against the darkness of cruelty. We must hold this truth with us as we navigate the complexities of our shared global existence, using the lessons of the past to light the way toward a future where every worker is empowered, protected, and treated with the fundamental respect that is their birthright. The light that these women brought from the shadows of Tafuna to the clarity of the federal courtroom is a light that must never be allowed to extinguish. It is the light of justice, the light of truth, and the light of human dignity, and it is our collective duty to ensure that it continues to burn brightly, serving as a permanent guide and a constant defense for the dignity of every individual across the globe, forevermore. The final chapter of this profound and harrowing narrative must be one of solemn introspection and an unwavering commitment to the future. As we step back from the specific details of the Daiwa factory, from the initial deceptive lure of the recruitment offices in Asia to the grim, corrugated walls of the Tafuna compound, and ultimately to the cold, decisive gavel of the federal court in Hawaii, we are left to contemplate the fundamental nature of justice. The tragedy was never merely about one man, Kil Su Lee, and his capacity for sadistic exploitation. It was a reflection of a wider, systemic failure to recognize the inherent value of the human being in the face of relentless, globalized capital. To truly honor the memory of the women who suffered, we must acknowledge that their plight was a direct consequence of a world that too often prioritizes the efficient, low-cost production of goods over the protection of the lives that create those goods. The story of Daiwa serves as a permanent, indelible record of what happens when the moral compass of society is allowed to drift, when geographical distance is mistaken for a lack of responsibility, and when the most vulnerable members of our global community are treated as nothing more than disposable, anonymous units of production. We must carry the weight of this knowledge into every aspect of our lives, from the professional spheres where supply chain decisions are made to the personal choices we exercise as global consumers. The legacy of the Daiwa survivors is not contained in the legal textbooks or the landmark legislation they helped to inspire. It is written in the ongoing struggle for accountability and the persistent demand for a global economy that reflects our deepest, most humane values. The resilience they displayed, from the moment they first realized they were being deceived to the day they stood as witnesses in a foreign courtroom, remains a powerful testament to the unquenchable nature of the human spirit. Their triumph was not just in surviving their tormentor, but in ensuring that their suffering became a catalyst for a structural, enduring change that would protect others from experiencing the same nightmare. This is the true, ultimate victory of the Daiwa case, that the intended victims of a cruel, profit-driven system became the very agents who brought that system to its knees. The journey toward a world where such atrocities are unthinkable is a path that requires the active, engaged participation of every generation. It is a path defined by the refusal to accept the status quo, by the demand for radical transparency in the global marketplace, and by the conviction that human rights are universal, inalienable, and non-negotiable. As we reflect on the lessons learned from the factory in American Samoa, we must ask ourselves how we can better support the institutions that defend these rights, and how we can foster a culture that rejects the commodification of human life. The story provides us with a clear, unambiguous mandate. We must be the guardians of the dignity of others, particularly those who, due to their circumstances or location, find themselves on the margins of power. This is not an abstract, philosophical task. It is a practical, daily necessity that informs how we build our laws, how we regulate our industries, and how we interact with the people who manufacture the objects of our modern life. In the final analysis, the story of the Daiwa factory is a story about the intersection of the personal and the political, the local and the global. It reminds us that our interconnectedness is not merely an economic reality, but a profound, moral reality. The pain inflicted in a small village in the South Pacific is not detached from our own lives. It is a shared trauma that demands a shared response. The justice that was secured in the federal courts was a triumph of the law, but it was also a triumph of the shared, collective conscience of those who refused to look away. This is the hope that sustains us as we look toward the future, the belief that when the truth is brought into the light, and when the victims are centered in the narrative, the power of justice can overcome the darkest, most entrenched systems of greed. We are tasked with keeping this hope alive, with ensuring that the light of truth continues to guide our actions, and that the memory of the Daiwa tragedy serves as an eternal barrier against the encroachment of similar forms of exploitation. The journey of the women, from their rural homes to the halls of justice, has become a cornerstone of the human rights movement, a story that will continue to educate and empower long after we are gone. We honor them by refusing to allow their experiences to be forgotten, by using their voices to challenge the powerful, and by remaining committed to the protection of every vulnerable worker, everywhere. The legacy of Daiwa is a living, breathing commitment to a world where freedom, dignity, and justice are not merely goals to be pursued, but the fundamental, guaranteed reality for every human being. As we move forward, we carry this commitment in our hearts and in our actions, building a future that is worthy of the resilience and the courage shown by those who dared to defy their enslaver. The story is theirs to tell, and it is our responsibility to hear it, to learn from it, and to act upon it with the full force of our conviction. May the memory of the Daiwa tragedy serve as a guidepost for all who strive for a more just world. May it be the source of our strength, the foundation of our reform, and the constant reminder of our shared moral duty. Let us pledge that the suffering of those women will not be in vain, that their endurance will be the catalyst for a lasting, global evolution in the protection of human dignity, and that we will remain, always, the protectors of those who cannot protect themselves. The factory is closed, the perpetrator is imprisoned, but the work of justice is only beginning. We must build on the foundation laid by these survivors, ensuring that their legacy of courage and truth becomes the bedrock of a global order where every individual is empowered to live a life free from the threat of exploitation. This is our promise, this is our mission, and this is the enduring, transformative legacy of the Daiwa factory, which will continue to illuminate the way for the progress of humanity for all time. As we conclude this reflection, let us recognize that the fight against slavery and exploitation is not a battle to be won in a single moment, but a persistent, dedicated effort that defines the health and the integrity of our society. The story of Daiwa is the embodiment of this truth, a clear warning of the darkness that can emerge when justice is neglected, but also a shining, hopeful testament to the power of truth to reclaim freedom. May we always keep the voices of those women at the center of our efforts. May we always listen to the demands of the marginalized, and may we never lose sight of our collective responsibility to ensure that no person is ever again treated as property, that no dream is ever again crushed by the weight of greed, and that the promise of a dignified, free life is available to every individual, in every nation, in every corner of our shared world. This, finally, is the legacy of the women who stood in the factory at Tafuna, the legacy that we must protect, uphold, and cherish as we look toward a future defined by justice, equality, and the unshakable dignity of the human person, forever and always. The resonance of the Daiwa tragedy as it fades into the historical record is not a silent disappearance, but rather a transformation into an active, protective shield for the global workforce. As we delve into the final considerations of this case, we must recognize that the courtroom outcome, while essential, was merely the concluding act of a much longer, more complex struggle that began in the hearts and minds of the women themselves. Their journey, marked by the transformation from victims of a highly organized criminal enterprise to catalysts for systemic change, remains the most potent illustration of how individual resilience can confront and defeat institutional malice. The factory at Tafuna, with its rusted metal walls and the echo of the PVC pipes against human flesh, has been dismantled, but the lessons it provided are now part of the foundational knowledge required for any serious engagement with human rights in the 21st century. We are tasked with ensuring that this knowledge is not buried in the archives, but is instead applied with constant, renewed vigor in every sphere where labor and capital intersect. This perpetual vigilance is the true inheritance of the Daiwa survivors. They did not just win a legal battle, They changed the vocabulary of human rights by demonstrating that exploitation can never be dismissed as an unfortunate side effect of economic progress. They forced the international community to acknowledge that the pursuit of cheap manufacturing is a moral imperative that requires constant, independent oversight to ensure that it does not devolve into the dehumanization of the workers. This shift in perspective is the most enduring contribution to the safety of modern laborers. Companies that previously operated under the assumption that they could outsource their moral responsibilities to distant, unregulated corners of the world now face a different reality, one defined by the precedent that human rights violations are traceable, prosecutable, and punishable, regardless of the complexity of the supply chain or the remoteness of the production site. The survivors, through their relentless pursuit of truth, established a new standard of accountability that continues to defend the dignity of workers across the globe. As we consider the trajectory of this legacy, we must also focus on the ongoing empowerment of migrant workers, who remain the most vulnerable to the deceptive and predatory tactics employed by international trafficking syndicates. The Daiwa case taught us that the primary tool of the enslaver is the isolation of the victim, not just the physical isolation of being thousands of miles from home, but the psychological isolation created by the threat of retaliation against loved ones back in the home country. Therefore, our future efforts must prioritize the creation of secure, transparent channels for migrant labor that are grounded in the principles of informed consent and the protection of fundamental human rights. This includes the institutionalization of robust, accessible reporting mechanisms and the fostering of direct, ongoing communication between migrant workers and their home governments, ensuring that no worker ever feels alone or abandoned, regardless of the distance from their home. The role of technology in this future-facing approach cannot be understated. While we have discussed how technology can be used to isolate, it is equally true that digital tools, when used properly, offer unprecedented opportunities for connection and transparency. We must envision a future where workers have the digital tools necessary to verify the credentials of their employers, to access independent legal counsel, and to communicate their conditions to global organizations. The history of the Daiwa factory reminds us that the ability to reach out, to be heard, and to document one's reality is the ultimate safeguard against the impunity of traffickers. As we advance in the digital age, we must ensure that these safeguards are at the forefront of policy, creating a global environment where the voices of the vulnerable are amplified, heard, and acted upon with the full force of the law and the moral commitment of the international community. Reflecting on the totality of the Daiwa experience, we must also acknowledge the role of the consumer in maintaining this vigilance. Every purchase we make is a vote in the global economy, and the power of the consumer to demand ethical production practices is a critical component of the anti-trafficking movement. The tragedy at Tafuna has equipped the global consumer with the knowledge that the absence of visible abuse is not equivalent to the presence of ethical labor practices. By insisting on transparency and supporting companies that undergo rigorous, transparent auditing, we become active participants in the protection of those who are most at risk. The legacy of the women is thus not only a challenge to governments and corporations, but a personal call to action for every person who participates in the global market. We are the ultimate monitors of the global supply chain, and our awareness and our choices are the final, and perhaps most effective, line of defense against the resurgence of such atrocities. The emotional and psychological recovery of the survivors remains a cornerstone of the case's legacy, serving as a reminder that justice is not only about the punishment of the guilty, but also the restoration of the humanity of the innocent. Their success in rebuilding their lives, in finding their voices, and in participating in the global effort to end human trafficking is a triumph that should be celebrated and supported. We must ensure that the institutional support systems for survivors of trafficking are robust, well-funded, and deeply empathetic, recognizing the long-term nature of trauma recovery and the importance of empowering survivors to lead the efforts to combat the very systems that harm them. The survivors of the Daiwa factory have become the leaders of the anti-trafficking movement, and their insights, born from their own harrowing experiences, are the most valuable assets we have in the fight for a world where every individual is free from the threat of exploitation. As we draw this narrative to its close, we must reaffirm our shared commitment to the principles of freedom, dignity, and justice. The Daiwa tragedy, as devastating as it was, serves as a beacon of truth that guides us toward a more equitable future. It is a story that reveals the darkest capacities of human greed, but also the most brilliant, unshakable capacities of human courage. By keeping this story alive, by learning from the survivors, and by acting with the persistence and conviction they demonstrated, we ensure that the light of their humanity continues to shape our progress. The story of the factory in Tafuna is a story that belongs to all of humanity, a story that reminds us of the fragility of the freedoms we enjoy and the immense, collective responsibility we have to protect those freedoms for everyone, everywhere. It is a promise to the women of Daiwa that their suffering will never be forgotten, that the change they initiated will be sustained, and that the world will continue to be reshaped by the values of justice and dignity that they upheld with such incredible strength. Ultimately, the final lesson of the Daiwa story is that justice is not a static destination but a living, breathing, and deeply demanding practice. It is a practice that requires us to look into the darkness and find the courage to bring the truth into the light. It requires us to listen to the voices of those who have been marginalized and to honor their resilience by translating their struggle into lasting, systemic reform. It requires us to stand as guardians of one another, recognizing that our destinies are tied together in a global fabric where the abuse of one is the responsibility of all. The women who walked into the Tafuna factory were looking for a chance to improve their lives and the lives of their families, and while they were met with a nightmare instead, their legacy has secured the dignity of countless others. Their struggle has redefined the moral landscape of our world, and it is now our collective mission to ensure that this landscape remains, forever, a landscape of justice, equality, and the unyielding respect for the inherent worth of every human being, regardless of their origin, their status, or the challenges they may face. This is the enduring, transformative, and ultimate promise that we make to the women of Daiwa, and it is a promise that we must keep through our actions, our vigilance, and our unwavering commitment to the dignity of the human person for all time to come.